Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. On the evening of May 28, 2023, in the small Italian town of Sonego, 29-year-old Giulia Tramontano vanished without a trace. 7 months pregnant, she stopped responding to calls and messages from loved ones, and her phone suddenly went silent. The first person to report her disappearance was the man she lived with, Alessandro in Palanton. He insisted that when he returned home from work, he found the apartment empty and had no idea where his partner could have gone. From the very beginning, there were too many unusual details in this case. Giulia had left behind most of her personal belongings, and her plans for the near future gave no indication that she intended to disappear. As investigators began piecing together her last known activities, they uncovered even more troubling facts. The night before she went missing, Giulia had sent messages to her mother, Loredana, and a close friend, revealing that she had a serious argument with Alessandro. She was deeply upset and wrote that the situation was causing her a great deal of distress, but the most important question remained unanswered. What really happened that fateful evening? And if Giulia had truly left the house on her own, why had no one seen her since? In the days that followed, investigators would begin unraveling a web of deception that would lead to a grim truth. Giulia Tramontano was born on May 2, 1994, in the small town of Sant'Animo, located in the Naples province. She grew up in a close-knit family, where support and warmth were always present. Her parents encouraged independence and self-confidence from an early age. While they embraced modern views, family traditions remained a cornerstone of their lives, and home was always a place she could return to for guidance and comfort. Giulia attended a local school, excelling in the humanities. She was drawn to real estate, fascinated by architecture, investment opportunities, and the idea of becoming a successful real estate agent. After high school, she pursued a degree in the field, quickly mastering the profession thanks to her analytical mindset and strong communication skills. By the age of 25, she had built a solid reputation in the industry, but for Giulia, this wasn't enough. She dreamed of life in a big city filled with opportunities. By the time she turned 26, her career in her hometown had reached a plateau. Working at a real estate agency, she realized the local market had its limitations. Inspired by stories from friends, she made the decision to move to Milan, a city she believed would offer her a new chapter filled with potential. By the end of 2020, her decision was final. Milan symbolized independence, new connections, and the career growth she longed for. The transition happened quickly. Packing her belongings and saying goodbye to her loved ones, she set off for the city that she hoped would become her new home. After moving to Milan, Giulia immediately immersed herself in work. The city's real estate market was fast-paced, competitive, and required confidence and persistence. She adapted quickly, building connections, attending networking events, and closing deals. Her new life was exciting, but amid her busy schedule, she found herself longing for something more, personal happiness. It was during this time that she met Alessandro in Palanton. Their paths crossed at a Milan bar where her colleagues had invited her to celebrate a successful deal. Alessandro worked as a bartender at a high-end lounge inside a 5-star hotel. A year older than Giulia, he was charming, outgoing, and had a natural ability to connect with people. His confidence and charisma drew her in. With him, she felt like she could relax, momentarily escape the pressures of work, and simply enjoy the present. The first few weeks of their relationship felt effortless. They spent evenings dining at restaurants, strolling through the city at night, and talking about the future. Alessandro shared that he had a son from a previous relationship, but assured her that his past was behind him and that he was now looking for stability. Giulia believed she had finally met someone with whom she could build a lasting relationship. Their romance moved quickly, and within a few months, they decided to move in together. Giulia sincerely hoped that her move to Milan would bring not only career growth, but also personal fulfillment. She was convinced that Alessandro was the person she was meant to build a future with, but at the time, she had no idea what secrets he was hiding, or how much her decision would change the course of her life. Alessandro in Palanton was born in 1993. Despite the confident image he projected, his life in Milan was far from stable. Working as a bartender at an exclusive venue, he was constantly surrounded by wealthy clients, successful business people, and celebrities. This allowed him to carefully craft the persona of a man accustomed to luxury. He was skilled at making people feel at ease, quick to form connections, and a master of persuasion, always hiding his true intentions behind charm and an easygoing nature. His job at the bar provided not only a steady income, but also valuable social ties. He knew how to present himself in the best possible light, creating the illusion of a man striving for more. His colleagues saw him as charismatic, yet somewhat superficial, someone who never truly opened up but maintained the appearance of a fun, carefree personality. To clients and acquaintances, he seemed to be living the dream. But behind this carefully curated image, there was much more that remained unseen. When he first started dating Julia, there were no apparent red flags. On the contrary, in the early stages of their relationship, he appeared attentive and caring. He knew exactly what to say and how to make a good impression. But over time, Alessandro's true nature began to emerge. Over time, problems began to surface in their relationship. The first warning signs appeared soon after they moved in together. Alessandro often joked around with Julia, but his teasing gradually became more cutting. He would comment on her accent, hinting that people from southern Italy were different from northerners in a way that wasn't exactly flattering. He openly mocked her favorite soccer team, knowing how much it meant to her. At first, Julia brushed it off, thinking it was just harmless teasing. But as time went on, it became clear that there was something more behind his words. Their arguments became more frequent. Alessandro grew irritated over small things. How she organized their home, how she reacted to his words, how she answered his questions. He would abruptly cut off conversations or ignore her altogether, making her feel like she was the one in the wrong. In those moments, he became cold and distant, only to suddenly switch back to his usual self, as if nothing had happened. This emotional roller coaster became their new normal. One day, he would be affectionate and attentive. The next, completely indifferent. Julia tried to understand what was happening, but she never got any clear answers. Alessandro never spoke openly about his feelings, leaving her in a constant state of uncertainty. But the biggest deception, the one she never saw coming, was his double life. Julia believed that when Alessandro left for work, he was spending his nights behind the bar. But in reality, he had been living a lie for months. Not long after they moved in together, he started seeing another woman, Allegra. He met Allegra at work. She was younger, multilingual, and building a career in the hospitality industry. Alessandro presented himself as a single man who had ended things with Julia long ago, but was still living with her due to temporary circumstances. He skillfully maintained this illusion, assuring Allegra that Julia was already looking for a new apartment and would be moving out soon. Neither Julia nor Allegra had any idea the other existed. To each of them, he played a different role, weaving his lies so seamlessly that nothing seemed suspicious. With one, he talked about the future. With the other, he lived in the moment, never once considering that his deception might come crashing down. Meanwhile, tensions in his relationship with Julia continued to build. She sensed that something was off, but couldn't quite figure out what it was. As time passed, the unease grew. Yet Alessandro kept up his double act, unaware that the truth was closing in on him. By the end of 2022, Julia started noticing changes in her body. Persistent fatigue, unusual cravings, and a cycle made her suspect something was different. Not wanting to wait, she bought a pregnancy test. When she saw 2 clear lines appear, the realization hit her. She was expecting a child. The news brought mixed emotions. On one hand, she had always dreamed of having a family. On the other, the last few months with Alessandro had been difficult. Still, she knew she had to tell him in person. Choosing the right moment, Julia nervously shared the news. She had imagined a range of possible reactions. Shock, happiness, maybe even a little fear. But Alessandro's face remained unreadable. He was silent for several seconds before asking just one question. "Are you sure?" Julia felt a chilling distance in his demeanor. He showed no curiosity, asked no questions about how far along she was, or how she was feeling. His indifference was impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, he never brought up the topic again. No discussions about the future, no interest in upcoming doctor's visits. Julia felt abandoned, but held on to hope that, in time, he would come to terms with the situation and start showing some level of support. The new year began, but Alessandro's attitude remained unchanged. More and more, Julia found herself spending evenings alone contemplating her future. She kept working, trying to focus on other things, but an uneasy feeling grew inside her. Meanwhile, Alessandro's double life took an unexpected turn. In early 2023, he learned that his other partner, Allegra, was also expecting. The news caught him completely off guard. Just like Giulia, Allegra had no idea another woman was in the picture. She truly believed she and Alessandro were in a committed relationship. Unlike Giulia, however, Allegra was unsure whether she wanted to continue the pregnancy. Realizing that his carefully constructed deception was falling apart, Alessandro convinced Allegra that having a child wasn't the right decision at that moment. He assured her that he would support whatever choice she made, but strongly implied that ending the pregnancy would be for the best. Allegra hesitated for a long time, but eventually agreed. Alessandro accompanied her to the medical procedure, ensuring that this chapter was closed. He hoped that, with Allegra's pregnancy no longer an issue, he could now focus on dealing with what he saw as his bigger problem, Giulia's decision to have the baby. But unlike Allegra, Giulia was determined to continue her pregnancy, despite his emotional distance. He repeatedly tried to persuade her to reconsider, but Giulia refused to change her mind. For her, this was a conscious and personal decision. She knew that her relationship with Alessandro was falling apart, but she was prepared to raise the baby on her own. What she didn't realize was that this choice would become the turning point of her fate. After Giulia refused to terminate the pregnancy, Alessandro realized he was losing control of the situation. Her firm decision disrupted his plans and forced him to look for another way to free himself from what he saw as a problem. By the end of 2022, he had begun systematically researching poisons. He scoured the internet for ways to cause harm without raising suspicion, analyzing which substances were both effective and difficult to detect. His research covered chemical compounds found in household products, plant-based toxins, and even highly dangerous substances like ricin and cyanide. However, most of the options he found were either too difficult to obtain or left clear traces in the body. Eventually, he settled on rodenticides, products designed to eliminate rodents. These were widely available over the counter and wouldn't raise any red flags. He also found information suggesting that certain types worked slowly, causing internal bleeding, weakness, and anemia, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for pregnancy complications. By early 2023, Alessandro began putting his plan into action. He started adding small amounts of the toxic substance to Giulia's food and drinks, hoping that her health would gradually decline. Within weeks, she began experiencing unusual symptoms, constant exhaustion, dizziness, nausea, and sharp abdominal pain. Giulia confided in her about how unwell she felt, but assumed it was just part of the pregnancy. She had no idea that something much more sinister was happening. Alessandro closely monitored her condition, expecting the effects to intensify, but the poison wasn't working as quickly as he had hoped. Frustrated, he continued searching for ways to increase its potency, but the results remained disappointing. Giulia still felt sick, but her body was fighting back, and the pregnancy was progressing. This infuriated Alessandro. His original plan had failed, and now he was forced to consider another way out. Alessandro was used to being in control. He carefully crafted his lies, knowing exactly what to say and how to convince each woman of his version of reality. Giulia believed he was simply going through a difficult phase, and that, in time, he would come around to accepting the pregnancy. Allegra, on the other hand, was certain that his past relationship had ended long ago, but one wrong move shattered his carefully constructed illusion. The first red flag for Allegra was how uneasy Alessandro became whenever the topic of his past came up. He avoided discussing his life before they met, never shared his social media, and made no mention of his ex. At first, it didn't seem suspicious, but over time, inconsistencies started piling up. The real turning point came when she accidentally saw photos on his phone, recent pictures of him with Giulia. The way they looked at each other, the closeness between them, it was clear that their relationship was far from over. Allegra didn't want to jump to conclusions. Instead, she started paying closer attention, taking mental notes. He often left in the evenings, claiming he was working late, yet his coworkers at the hotel mentioned that he had clocked out early. Sometimes he wouldn't answer his phone, later coming up with excuses that didn't quite add up. When Allegra finally confronted him about the photos, Alessandro didn't miss a beat. His reaction was instant. He claimed Giulia couldn't accept their breakup and was deliberately spreading those pictures to manipulate him with guilt. Allegra wanted to believe him, but something about his explanation felt off. She started asking more questions, and his responses became increasingly unconvincing. Sensing he was losing control, Alessandro abruptly changed tactics. He claimed Giulia wasn't just refusing to move on. She had actually faked her pregnancy in a desperate attempt to hold on to him. Now he was trying to convince Allegra that there was no baby at all, but his desperation only fueled her suspicions. In a final attempt to solidify his lie, Alessandro went so far as to fabricate a DNA test. He altered a file he had downloaded online, presenting it as proof that he had no connection to the child. Allegra initially accepted this version of events, but her doubts lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she didn't know. A few days later, she decided to find out for herself. While Alessandro was asleep, she took his phone, found Giulia's number, and sent her a message. The reply came almost instantly. Giulia didn't sound like a woman consumed by revenge. On the contrary, she also wanted answers. The next day, Allegra suggested they meet in person. Both women understood that this conversation would change everything. Their meeting took place at the hotel where Allegra worked. They had agreed on a time in advance, both feeling a mix of tension and determination. Allegra still didn't know the full extent of Alessandro's deception, and Giulia couldn't believe that the man she had planned a future with had been leading a double life. The conversation started cautiously. Allegra spoke first, sharing what she had discovered. She told Giulia how Alessandro had assured her that his past relationship was completely over. Then she mentioned the so-called DNA test that supposedly proved the baby wasn't his. Giulia listened carefully. When Allegra finished speaking, she calmly stated that the test was fake. She had never suggested any kind of testing, and the timeline of her pregnancy aligned perfectly with their relationship. More importantly, she revealed that she and Alessandro were still living together, and at no point had he given her any reason to believe their relationship was over. With every passing minute, Allegra saw the situation more clearly. She had been deceived from the very beginning. Her entire perception of their relationship shifted, and for the first time, she had no doubts about the truth. Hurt and disappointment washed over her, but she felt no resentment toward Giulia. Instead, it became painfully obvious that they had both fallen victim to the same web of lies. Their conversation lasted over an hour. The two women compared details, piecing together the full picture of Alessandro's deception. By the end, they no longer saw each other as rivals. What emerged instead was an unexpected sense of solidarity. At that moment, Giulia made her final decision. She was done. She had no intention of staying with a man who had manipulated her feelings while hiding a second life. Her future belonged to her and her child, and Alessandro had no place in it. When she returned home, she didn't wait for the right moment. She confronted Alessandro immediately, telling him she knew everything and that their relationship was over. His reaction was exactly as expected. First, he denied everything, then he turned defensive, accusing her of digging into his personal life. But Giulia wasn't listening to his excuses. She firmly told him that she was leaving for Naples and wanted nothing more to do with him. That evening, she texted her mother and sister explaining her decision. They supported her fully, offering to help in any way they could. Giulia reassured them, saying she needed to take care of a few things in Milan first, but would be home in a few days. She didn't know that night would be her last. After their conversation, Alessandro realized he had lost control. Everything he had hidden was now exposed. Giulia knew the truth about his double life, his lies, and his manipulation. She no longer believed him, no longer listened to him, and had made a firm decision to leave. Her calmness infuriated him. He couldn't understand how he had ended up in a situation where his deception had been uncovered, leaving him powerless. He felt himself losing not just his control over Giulia, but also his carefully crafted image. If she told anyone else, his entire life could come crashing down. That day, the tension between them reached its breaking point. Giulia ignored all of Alessandro's attempts to speak. She continued packing her things, showing no emotion. Her silence only made him angrier. Alessandro tried to convince her that she was making a mistake, that he loved her, that she needed to reconsider. But Giulia didn't respond. His frustration grew. He raised his voice, desperate to get a reaction, but she refused to argue. When he realized her decision was final, uncontrollable rage took over. He grabbed a knife from the counter, and in a blind fury, he struck. Giulia didn't have time to react. The attack was sudden, precise, but it wasn't enough for him to stop. He kept going, driven by panic and fear of exposure. He lost all sense of restraint, 37 stab wounds. Alessandro stood over her body, staring at the reality of what he had just done. Now, he needed to get rid of the evidence. He couldn't leave things as they were. He knew blood left traces. He understood that simply hiding the body wouldn't be enough. He dragged her to the bathroom, doused her with alcohol, and set her on fire, hoping it would erase the evidence. But the flames didn't do what he expected. The fire left burns, but didn't destroy the remains. Panic set in. He had no plan. He grabbed rags, cleaning supplies, and started scrubbing the blood from the floor, the walls, the furniture. He scrubbed and scrubbed, but the stains wouldn't completely disappear. The apartment still looked like a crime scene. He realized he wouldn't be able to erase all traces of what had happened. But despite that, he was convinced he could find a way to escape responsibility. He didn't yet know that investigators would soon piece together every clue and expose his guilt. Once Alessandro fully grasped what he had done, with Giulia's body lying in the bathroom, his first instinct was to cover his tracks. He had already tried to burn the evidence, but when that failed, he needed another plan. The first step was to stage her disappearance. He decided to make it look like Giulia had left voluntarily. To do this, he took her phone and began sending messages to her family and friends. He knew they would worry if she suddenly vanished, so he had to create the illusion that she had chosen to leave on her own. He texted her mother, saying she needed some time alone. The message was short and vague, just enough to avoid raising suspicion. Then he messaged one of Giulia's friends, claiming that she had left but wasn't ready to talk about where she was going. He was hoping to buy himself time, to make it seem like she had simply decided to disappear. However, his plan didn't end there. He knew that sooner or later someone would raise the alarm, so just hours after the crime, he went to the police himself and reported Giulia missing. He claimed that she had left home after an argument and never returned. His version was simple. That morning, he had gone to work, and when he came back, she was gone. He deliberately added details to make his story sound convincing. He told officers that her personal belongings, passport, and money were missing too, suggesting that she might have left town on her own. Investigators listened carefully, but from the start, something felt off. His demeanor raised suspicion. He spoke too confidently, as if he already knew what questions would be asked. Unlike Giulia's family and friends, who were panicked and desperate for answers, he remained unnervingly calm. While the police launched a search, Alessandro focused on hiding the evidence. At first, he left her remains in the bathroom, but knew he couldn't keep them there for long. He wrapped them in plastic and, under the cover of night, carried them to the garage. Over the next few days, he moved the remains multiple times. First, he hid them in the basement of their building, then returned them to the garage. He was trying to figure out a way to dispose of them permanently, but the longer he delayed, the more mistakes he made. Investigators began scrutinizing his statements, questioning neighbors, and looking for inconsistencies. While he believed he was still in control, law enforcement was already closing in on him. After Alessandro reported Giulia missing, the police followed standard procedures for a disappearance case. But the first major clue came when forensic specialists detected traces of blood in his car. Despite his efforts to clean it, modern forensic technology allowed investigators to identify biological evidence. A rapid analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Giulia. The second piece of evidence was found in the common areas of their apartment building. On the stairs and in the hallway, there were faint reddish stains that initially looked like dust or spilled liquid. However, chemical testing revealed they were traces of partially cleaned blood. Investigators also noted Alessandro's unusual behavior. Unlike most people whose loved ones disappear, he didn't display genuine concern. He didn't reach out to Giulia's family asking for help in finding her, nor did he actively participate in spreading information about her disappearance. He simply followed the formal steps required to report someone missing. Nothing more, which raised further suspicion. A key breakthrough in the case came when detectives examined his electronic devices. They seized his phone, computer, and tablet. What they found was shocking. First, they uncovered search history dating back months before the crime. He had looked up information on poisons, researched the effects of different toxins, and read articles on how to discreetly harm someone. There were even searches questioning why certain toxic substances might not work as expected. Another critical piece of evidence was the forged DNA test he had shown Allegra. A forensic examination confirmed that the document had been altered, and the file itself had been downloaded from a website that allowed users to edit medical records. The mounting evidence was closing in on Alessandro. His version of events was falling apart. Investigators intensified their pressure, pointing out inconsistencies one by one. At first, he stuck to his story, insisting he knew nothing. But with each interrogation, police presented more facts he couldn't escape from. They showed him photos of the bloodstains, confronted him with his own search history and brought in witnesses who had heard loud noises and shouting from their apartment. A key breakthrough in the investigation came when authorities analyzed Alessandro's movements in the days following Giulia's disappearance. Surveillance footage revealed that in the days after she was reported missing, he made multiple trips to the garage, carrying bags inside and later returning empty-handed. Under the weight of mounting evidence, Alessandro's story began to unravel. Eventually, he broke down and revealed the location where he had hidden her remains. On June 1, 2023, police discovered Giulia's body in an overgrown area near Sanago. Forensic analysis confirmed that an attempt had been made to burn the remains, but the process had been interrupted. Despite his efforts to cover his tracks, experts were able to determine the cause of death and gather definitive evidence linking him to the crime. The revelation of Giulia Tramontano's tragic fate sent shockwaves across Italy. In a country where cases of gender-based crimes have long been a serious concern, her case became another painful reminder of the dangers posed by individuals who hide behind the mask of a caring partner. Following Alessandro Impalanton's arrest, protests erupted across the country. Women took to the streets holding signs and demanding stricter penalties for crimes rooted in domestic aggression. Memorial marches were held in Milan, Naples, Rome, and other cities, with calls for systemic reforms to better protect those at risk. At one of the rallies, Giulia's sister, Carla Tramontano, spoke out, urging lawmakers to take action against the alarming frequency of cases where individuals face no real consequences until it is too late. Meanwhile, forensic experts and investigators worked to understand the psychological profile of the perpetrator. Alessandro underwent a psychological evaluation, which revealed concerning behavioral traits. Court-appointed psychiatrists concluded that he displayed strong narcissistic tendencies. He showed no remorse for his actions, and his behavior during interrogations and court proceedings reflected deep-seated egocentrism and a complete lack of empathy. He viewed others solely through the lens of his own self-interest, disregarding their emotions and experiences. His actions were driven entirely by a desire to protect his own reputation and maintain control over those around him. Any loss of power triggered an immediate and dangerous response. During the trial, Alessandro attempted to appear remorseful, but his words failed to convince either Giulia's family or the public. He claimed he didn't understand how he could have done something so terrible, insisting it was a moment of impulsive rage, something he hadn't fully realized he was doing. However, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: his online searches about poisons, the attempted poisoning, the falsified DNA test, and the false report he made to the police. Each of these facts proved that the crime was premeditated. Following Alessandro's arrest and exposure, Allegra cooperated with authorities. She handed over her messages with him, which showed that he had deceived both her and Giulia. She also testified about the fake DNA test and his repeated attempts to manipulate her. During the trial, Allegra appeared as a witness. Prosecutors called her to confirm key details: how Alessandro had hidden his double life, how he had lied about Giulia's pregnancy, and the excuses he made when the truth began to unravel. According to those in the courtroom, Allegra looked deeply shaken. She realized that if she hadn't accidentally found those photos on his phone, the truth might have come to light too late. During her testimony, she spoke about the guilt she felt toward Giulia, even though she understood she had also been a victim of his deception. After the trial, Allegra refused to speak with journalists, avoided the public eye, and tried to distance herself from the tragedy. Reports indicated that she later left Milan and moved to another city, hoping to rebuild her life far from the memories tied to this case. The court found Alessandro guilty of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. These included the cruelty of the crime, the prolonged emotional mistreatment of the victim, and his deliberate efforts to destroy evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison. In the judge's final statement, it was emphasized that crimes like this could not be excused as moments of lost control or temporary emotional distress. Alessandro's actions over several months demonstrated a clear and deliberate intent to get rid of Giulia. Her case became a tragic reminder of the dangers posed by individuals who view their partners as possessions. But Giulia's story did not go unnoticed. It sparked outrage and became part of a broader movement to protect those who could still be saved. Case 2. In May 2023, Spanish police received a distressing call from a quiet neighborhood in Malaga. In one of the apartments, they discovered the body of a young woman with multiple stab wounds. The suspect fled the scene but was apprehended hours later at a local cafe. However, this tragedy was only the beginning of a series of events that led investigators to an unsolved case from 9 years prior. Behind the wall of another apartment, they found something that shocked even the most experienced forensic experts. In 2011, Sabora Gagani lived with her boyfriend Marco in Spain, in the Laurel neighborhood near the beaches of Torremolinos. On the surface, their life seemed stable. Sabora worked as a waitress in a local restaurant, while Marco worked as a chef. They rented a small house, and Sabora often called her mother, Elisabetta, assuring her that everything was fine. However, behind this appearance of stability lay serious problems that became more evident with each passing month. When Elisabetta came to Spain to visit her daughter, she immediately noticed the tense atmosphere in the home. Arguments between Sabora and Marco broke out even in her presence. Elisabetta saw how her daughter tried to justify Marco's bursts of jealousy and tension, blaming them on temporary difficulties. However, Elisabetta was convinced that the problems went far beyond day-to-day struggles. It was hard to believe that just 2 years earlier, Sabora had been a completely different person. Born on September 14, 1991, in Tirana, Albania, she was known from a young age for her lively and cheerful personality. After her parents divorced, her mother, Elisabetta, moved with her children to Italy, where they started a new life. In Rome, Sabora quickly became popular with those around her. Her classmates gave her the nickname Sibi, highlighting her energy and friendliness. Despite financial challenges, Sabora was eager to support her family from a young age. She started working as a waitress in a local cafe, but never gave up on her dreams. Her natural beauty, slim figure, and success in a regional beauty contest opened the door to opportunities in the modeling world. Despite this, her biggest dream was to become a teacher, as Sabora genuinely loved working with children. Things began to change when Sabora turned 18. At a cafe, she met Marco, a 31-year-old man whose charm and confidence immediately caught her attention. At the time, she knew little about him. He was divorced, had a sister, and seemed to want to start a new chapter in life. However, behind this facade lay a complicated past. Marco was known for his aggressive behavior and problems with controlled substances, which had brought him to the attention of the police on multiple occasions. Sabora, captivated by his charisma, chose to overlook these warning signs. A year into their relationship, Marco suggested that Sabora move with him to Spain, claiming there were better job opportunities there than in Italy. Elisabetta tried to dissuade her daughter, doubting Marco's intentions, but Sabora insisted. She believed this move would mark the beginning of a new chapter, where she and Marco could build a happy life together. At first, things in Spain seemed promising. Sabora quickly found work as they rented a cozy home, and Sabora shared her plans with her mother, sounding optimistic about the future. However, their stability was short-lived. Marco began losing one job after another, blaming his employers for his failures. His irritability and jealousy grew more pronounced, and his aggressive behavior escalated from minor incidents into serious conflicts. When Elisabetta traveled to Spain to see how her daughter was doing, she was shocked by what she found. Sabora, once lively and confident, now seemed withdrawn and subdued. Marco didn't even try to hide his irritation in Elisabetta's presence. Their arguments grew louder, but despite the clear issues, Sabora continued to defend Marco, assuring her mother that things would improve. Why Sabora chose to overlook these red flags puzzled those close to her. Perhaps she sought in Marco the support and stability she had lacked in her early years. Her family, having moved from Albania to Italy, had endured tough times. Elisabetta worked tirelessly to provide a better life for her children, but Sabora faced the need to shoulder responsibility at an early age. Her relationship with Marco might have been an attempt to fill that void, but instead it only brought more strain. Life in Spain was increasingly becoming a struggle for Sabora, as the bright dreams of her youth gradually faded into distant memories. In July 2014, Sabora Gagani disappeared suddenly, leaving her family in anguish. The last known contact she had was a text message to Marco, her former partner, on July 7th. After that, her phone was turned off and her social media accounts went silent. This behavior was uncharacteristic of her. Prior to that, Sabora had informed her mother that she had finally ended things with Marco, moved into a new apartment, and felt liberated. She described it as feeling like a butterfly that had just emerged from its cocoon. But her sudden silence alarmed everyone. The situation took an even stranger turn when Marco unexpectedly appeared at Elisabetta's home in Italy. He tried to present himself as a concerned and regretful man, pretending to care deeply about what had happened. Over coffee, he told Elisabetta that he had no idea where Sabora could have gone. According to Marco, they had argued shortly before she vanished, and she had walked out, leaving all her belongings behind. Later, Marco changed his story, claiming that a security guard at their apartment complex had supposedly seen Sabora leaving with 2 suitcases. These conflicting statements only deepened suspicions and heightened concerns. Elisabetta recalled that just a month prior, Sabora had shared her decision to end the relationship for good. After 3 years of trying to salvage it, she had moved out of Marco's apartment and was working on rebuilding her life. During that time, she tried to distance herself from him, but it seemed this did little to stop his interest in her life. Marco continued to involve himself, showing an unsettling persistence. In early July, he unexpectedly called Elisabetta, asking if Sabora had returned to Italy. The question struck Elisabetta as odd, especially given their recent breakup. Sabora had made multiple attempts to cut ties with Marco. In 2013, she even returned to her mother's home in Italy, determined to leave everything behind. During that time, she admitted she no longer saw a future in their relationship, but Marco refused to let go. He showed up at their house in Italy, pleading with Sabora and promising to change. He even proposed to her. Worn out from the constant struggle, Sabora gave in to his promises. But the cycle soon resumed. Jealousy, control, and aggressive behavior began to destroy her sense of peace once again. At one point, she confided in her mother that if she ever decided to leave Marco for good, she might have to completely disappear, as she believed he wouldn't leave her alone. Over the following months, Sabora traveled frequently to Italy, likely because her Spanish residency permit had expired. There were reports suggesting she used a forged Italian ID for her travels. Elisabetta noticed her daughter seemed increasingly frightened, but Sabora rarely shared details. She only mentioned that she was searching for a way out of her difficult situation. By June 2014, Sabora had moved into a new apartment, trying to start fresh. She told her mother she had no intention of ever returning to Marco. For a short time, she seemed to regain a sense of freedom, but concerns about her safety lingered. When Marco claimed that she had left and abandoned all her belongings, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Sabora would never have severed contact with her family, especially not with her mother and brothers. Now the family could only wait, hoping that Sabora had indeed decided to go into hiding to escape Marco's control. Yet the conflicting accounts and complete lack of communication from her only raised more questions. By 2015, the investigation into Sabora Gagani's disappearance had made no significant progress despite the efforts of her family and law enforcement. Elisabetta, her mother, had been the driving force behind filing an official report with the authorities. She remained convinced that Marco, Sabora's former partner, was somehow involved, as he was the last known person to have seen her before she vanished. However, his behavior throughout the investigation only raised more suspicions. During questioning, Marco repeated his version of events. He claimed that Sabora had left their home after an argument, taking only a few belongings. However, many of her personal items, including clothing and identification documents, were still in the apartment, which seemed unusual. Despite his claims, Marco never reported her disappearance to the police. Instead, he insisted he try to locate Sabora on his own, printing and distributing flyers around their neighborhood. He also offered conflicting theories about her whereabouts, suggesting at one point that she might have traveled to Argentina, or that she had been seen with an unknown man with whom she supposedly had a confrontation. These statements lacked consistency and factual support. Elisabetta, distrustful of Marco, began her own efforts to find her daughter. She reached out to the media and a specialized organization that helps publicize cases of missing persons. Photos of Sabora and calls for assistance began appearing in both Italian and Spanish news outlets. Despite these efforts, no new leads were uncovered. While Sabora's family continued their search for answers, Marco appeared to lead a relatively ordinary life. He changed his appearance by shaving his head and growing a beard, seemingly trying to avoid attracting attention. During this time, he entered new relationships, but both ended with complaints from the women about his aggressive behavior. Still, Marco remained in Spain, frequently visiting the gym and joining a shooting club, which alarmed those aware of his history. Sabora's family refused to give up. Elisabetta repeatedly appealed to the police, urging them to intensify their investigation. Meanwhile, law enforcement began reviewing the case files, searching for any overlooked details. They scrutinized Marco's statements, which had appeared inconsistent from the beginning. His claim that Sabora left with suitcases conflicted with his assertion that she had walked out with nothing. Additionally, questions arose about why he had not contacted the police immediately after her disappearance. Over time, public interest in Sabora's case began to fade, despite her family's persistent efforts. Marco, still living in Spain, seemed to adjust to life following her disappearance. To his neighbors, he appeared to be a friendly individual who was focused on fitness and socializing. However, his past relationship with Sabora and the complaints from new partners continued to cast doubt on his character. As Sabora's family clung to hope for any news, the investigation remained at a standstill. Authorities expanded their efforts, utilizing international missing persons databases, but these measures yielded no results. For those closest to Sabora, the uncertainty surrounding her fate remained an unbearable ordeal. By 2023, Marco appeared to have turned his life around on the surface. He was living with a new partner named Paula, and they had a child together. However, beneath the facade of this seemingly fresh start were the same issues that had plagued Marco for years. His relationship with Paula was far from stable. She confided to close friends and coworkers that she experienced physical mistreatment from Marco. Meanwhile, Marco struggled to keep a steady job, which only worsened their financial troubles. While working at a pizzeria, Marco met Victor Molina, the restaurant owner, who eventually offered jobs to both him and Paula. Victor also rented the couple a small apartment, hoping to ease their financial difficulties. Unlike Marco, Paula quickly earned trust and respect at work. Victor and his sister Victoria, who also worked at the restaurant, became not only Paula's employers, but also a source of emotional support. Over time, Victoria learned more about the difficulties in Paula and Marco's relationship. After one particular incident, she began urging Paula to contact the police. According to Victoria, Marco was not only aggressive at work, but also provided no help at home. An incident at the restaurant marked a breaking point for Victor. The door to the staff restroom was found broken. Victoria learned from Paula that Marco had damaged it, accusing her of using the space to meet with coworkers. Following this, Victor reassigned Marco to a different location, keeping him under close supervision. Despite Paula's hard work and efforts to maintain the appearance of a normal life, she couldn't hide the challenges she faced. Her growing trust in Victoria allowed her to open up more. Paula revealed that she was staying with Marco only because it was the only way she could regain custody of her children, who had been removed from her care after authorities discovered prohibited substances in their home. The substances belonged to Marco, but the consequences had fallen on the entire family. For Paula, this was a deeply personal tragedy, and her primary goal was to save enough money to leave Marco and fight to regain custody. Meanwhile, Marco's situation continued to deteriorate. He frequently complained to Victor about his financial struggles, claiming he was only working for the sake of his family. Yet his actions and behavior told a different story. His aggression at work and inability to get along with coworkers led Victor to question whether keeping him employed was worth the trouble. At the same time, Victoria, seeing how dire Paula's situation was, continued to encourage her not to tolerate the mistreatment. However, Paula, fearing for her safety, avoided taking any confrontational steps. She admitted to Victoria that Marco had once struck her 4 times and kicked her, but she downplayed the seriousness of the incident. For Victoria and Victor, this was clear evidence that Paula's situation required urgent intervention. On Tuesday, May 16, 2023, Paula spent her day off in good spirits, sharing her plans for a relaxing and productive evening with her coworkers. She seemed optimistic and ready to unwind. The following day, May 17th, Victoria, Paula's coworker and close friend, was eager to hear about how her evening had gone. However, the day took a dark and unexpected turn. That morning, at around 11:30 a.m., loud shouting erupted from the apartment Paula shared with Marco. Though arguments between them were common, this time it sounded far more intense. Paula's voice was unmistakable, calling out for help. The commotion was so loud that Victor, Paula's landlord and employer, who happened to be nearby, could hear it clearly. Alarmed, he rushed toward the apartment with another employee from the restaurant. When they reached the door, the 2 men began knocking and shouting, trying to understand what was happening. From inside, they heard faint sobbing, which soon fell silent. Moments later, Marco opened the door. His demeanor was calm as he assured them everything was fine, claiming Paula had simply gone to bed to rest. However, Paula's voice was no longer audible, which deeply unsettled Victor. The situation was made even more concerning by recent events. Just a few days earlier, Victor had fired Marco from the restaurant following a series of troubling incidents, including the unexplained disappearance of a kitchen knife. Victor had grown increasingly distrustful of Marco and wanted to avoid further problems. Now, Marco found himself at the center of yet another alarming event. Victor left to retrieve a spare key to the apartment, while the other employee called the police. Marco, seemingly aware that the situation was escalating, remained calm but acted unexpectedly. Without any explanation, he left the apartment and walked out of the building. When the police arrived, they found the apartment locked. Everything inside appeared as though the occupants had recently left, adding to the growing mystery. Meanwhile, Victor returned with the spare key and entered the apartment to determine what had happened. Inside one of the rooms, they discovered Paula's body lying on the floor with multiple stab wounds. Her clothes were soaked in blood, and it was evident that she had passed away several hours earlier. The police immediately secured the scene, called in forensic specialists to collect evidence, and launched a search for Marco, who had fled by that time. Paula's body was sent for an autopsy to confirm the exact cause of death, while investigators worked to track down the suspect. Marco was located just a few hours later, sitting calmly at a table in a local cafe. He showed no resistance during his arrest and behaved as though nothing had happened. On May 20th, 2023, 3 days after Paula's tragic death, Marco appeared in court. He was charged with committing a crime with aggravating circumstances related to gender-based aggression. The court also ordered a psychiatric evaluation and testing for controlled substances. Marco was denied bail and remained in custody. During the hearing, Marco exercised his right to remain silent, speaking only to answer questions from his attorney. There was no mention of Sabora Gagani, whose disappearance he had previously alluded to. However, just days after his arrest, Sabora's name came back into the spotlight. On May 17th, the day of Paula's death, while being interrogated at the station, Marco made an unexpected confession. He claimed that during an argument in 2014, he had killed Sabora Gagani and hidden her body in the apartment they shared. Marco even offered to show investigators the exact location of her remains. Despite his confession, law enforcement chose to prioritize the investigation into Paula's death and temporarily delayed verifying Marco's statements about Sabora. For Sabora's mother, Elisabetta, the news of Marco's arrest and his admission regarding her daughter was a devastating blow. For 9 years, she had fought to reopen the investigation, believing Marco was involved in Sabora's disappearance. Following Marco's confession, the case of Sabora Gagani was officially reopened, and investigators began working to verify his claims, starting with an examination of the apartment where the couple had lived in 2014. By early June 2023, Spanish investigators focusing on Sabora's case conducted a detailed review of the building's layout where she and Marco had once resided. A thorough search of the apartment yielded no significant findings. However, discrepancies were found between the apartment's physical layout and its blueprints. This discovery shifted the investigators' attention to a neighboring unit on the same floor, which was nearly identical in design. One particular detail stood out. There was a large space that, according to the building plans, should have been part of the bedroom in the apartment under investigation, but it was not present in reality. After obtaining permission, investigators entered the neighboring apartment on June 6th and broke through the wall. Behind it, they discovered a large wooden box filled with lime. Inside the box, police uncovered the first set of evidence: a plastic bag containing a knife stained with dried blood and personal items believed to belong to Sabora. Among the items was a bouquet of wilted flowers lying atop several plastic bags. Inside, one of the bags was a camping sleeping bag which contained human remains. The remains were sent for forensic analysis to determine the identity and cause of death. Investigators noted tattoos on the body that matched descriptions provided in the missing persons report for Sabora Gagani. However, to confirm the identity conclusively, Spanish authorities requested DNA samples from Sabora's family in Italy. On June 10th, police arrived at the home of Sabora's mother, Elisabetta, to collect a saliva sample. The DNA results confirmed the remains belonged to Sabora Gagani. In the week following the discovery, new details about Marco's actions emerged in Spain. During interrogations, he claimed to have used acid in an attempt to dispose of the body, though this claim was not substantiated. Investigators noted Marco frequently altered his statements. His confessions following his arrest for Paula's death had prompted the reopening of Sabora's case. Meanwhile, authorities continued to investigate the circumstances surrounding her death. For Elisabetta, the confirmation of Sabora's remains was a devastating blow. 9 years of uncertainty had stripped her of hope, though she had never stopped waiting for answers about her daughter's fate. Over the years, her life had changed dramatically. Sabora's father had passed away from illness, never learning the truth about his daughter, and Elisabetta had found solace only in the birth of her grandson. When the remains were officially identified, Elisabetta reflected on her years of advocacy, repeatedly appealing to the police to reopen her daughter's case. While her efforts had finally brought answers, they also delivered a bittersweet sense of closure. Forensic experts continued to analyze the evidence recovered from the site where Sabora's remains were found. The knife discovered in the plastic bag was sent for forensic testing to identify biological traces that might link it to Marco. Meanwhile, Spanish investigators collaborated with their Italian counterparts to supplement the case materials from Sabora's disappearance. The investigation into Paula's death also remained ongoing, with Marco already the primary suspect. Despite the evidence and Marco's own admission of his involvement in Sabora's death, including revealing the location of her remains, he later retracted his confession. His attorney argued that Marco's statements had been made under duress and should not be admissible in court. However, investigators maintained that the evidence found in the concealed box, including Sabora's personal belongings, provided strong grounds for further charges. In January 2024, several months after the discovery of Sabora Gagani's remains, her family was finally able to lay her to rest. After all forensic examinations were completed, her remains were returned to her loved ones for burial. The ceremony took place in Italy, where friends and family gathered to say their final goodbyes. As a tribute, balloons were released into the sky with heartfelt messages, symbolizing hope and farewell. At the time, most attention was focused on the ongoing legal proceedings against Marco, who faced charges related to Paula's death. During a hearing on January 30th, 2024, Marco submitted a handwritten 17-page letter in which he admitted responsibility for her death, but included numerous caveats. He claimed that the conflict arose due to accumulated arguments over a €50 debt and his infidelity. According to Marco, during the altercation, he defended himself too strongly, which led to the tragedy. However, investigators determined that the wounds on Paula's body were located on her back, casting serious doubt on his self-defense claim. Despite his admissions regarding Paula, Marco refused to provide detailed information about Sabora's case. He did confirm that he had wrapped her body in plastic, placed it in a wooden box, covered it with flowers, layered it with lime, and sealed it within a wall. However, he denied being responsible for her death, attempting to justify his actions as a reaction to fear of the circumstances. During the trial, Marco abruptly changed his account of Sabora's death, presenting an entirely new version of events. He alleged that the Albanian mafia, which he claimed to have been connected to due to debts, was responsible for her death. According to Marco, he had borrowed €25,000 to open a brothel, but the money was stolen. Unable to repay the debt, he said that 4 men came to his home, and during an argument, one of them killed Sabora. Marco claimed he was then forced, under threat to his own life, to dispose of her body to avoid further consequences. This version of events raised significant doubts among investigators, as Marco had previously changed his statements multiple times. Throughout the investigation, it became evident that Marco had used falsehoods to mislead authorities, beginning with his arrest in May 2023 after Paula's death. His claims of mafia involvement were not supported by any evidence gathered during the investigation. The cause of Sabora's death was determined through an autopsy. Multiple stab wounds, which despite the condition of her remains, clearly indicated a violent crime. Sabora's family finally received confirmation of her fate years after she had been reported missing. Elisabetta, her mother, revealed that she had lived the past 9 years clinging to hope for answers, though Sabora's father had passed away without ever learning the truth. By May 2024, the trial for Paula's case was ongoing. The court decided to proceed with a jury trial to address charges of domestic aggression and homicide. Meanwhile, Sabora Gagani's case, though reopened, had not yet gone to trial. Investigators continued to scrutinize Marco's claims, including his allegations of mafia involvement. Further court proceedings were anticipated. The stories of Sabora Gagani and Paula highlight how destructive relationships, marked by manipulation and abusive behavior, can have devastating consequences. Sabora, who had dreamed of a bright future, and Paula, who was striving to reclaim control of her life, both fell victim to the same person. Their fates serve as a somber reminder of the importance of recognizing the signs of abusive behavior early and intervening to prevent further tragedies. Case 3. On the evening of October 24, 2009, 58-year-old Chris Marks, a successful, professional, and devoted mother, left her home with a sense of hope. She was on her way to reconnect with her daughter Taylor, who was 20 years old and had been adopted by Chris years earlier. Earlier that day, Taylor had called, asking Chris to pick her up from her boyfriend Brian's house. This request was an unexpected olive branch after a long period of tension between them. Chris arrived at Brian's house around 7 p.m. The neighborhood, located in Akron, Ohio, was known for its high crime rates and general sense of unease. Despite her apprehensions, Chris parked her car, walked to the door, and knocked. Taylor answered, and Chris, struggling to contain her joy, embraced her. There seemed to be no visible tension between them. Shortly after, Brian joined them to escort both women back to Chris's car. To Chris, everything seemed normal, though the area itself left her uneasy. As they walked toward the car, the situation took a turn. A man suddenly appeared behind them, armed with a knife. The attack was swift and brutal. Chris was struck multiple times in the chest and face before she had a chance to defend herself. She collapsed to the ground. Taylor screamed and quickly grabbed her phone to call emergency services. In the recording of her call, she can be heard pleading for help, explaining that her mother had been attacked. While Taylor was on the line with the dispatcher, Brian took the phone from her. He provided their location and described the incident, claiming the attacker had fled. His tone was unnervingly calm, lacking the urgency one might expect from someone who had just witnessed such a violent event. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Chris was still alive, but in critical condition. She was transported to the hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to save her. Despite their efforts, Chris Marks was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The primary cause of death was multiple stab wounds inflicted with alarming force. At the scene, law enforcement quickly noted several inconsistencies. Chris's purse, containing her belongings, cash, keys, and documents, was found untouched near the site of the attack. This detail conflicted with the typical pattern of a robbery. Additionally, a bloodied knife, believed to be the weapon used, was discovered in nearby bushes. These findings raised questions about the accounts provided by the witnesses and suggested the possibility of deeper motives behind the crime. The police began questioning everyone involved: Taylor, Brian, and Brian's friend Troy, who had been inside the house during the attack. Their accounts were inconsistent and contradictory. Taylor claimed she had only seen the silhouette of the attacker, describing someone wearing red sneakers and a flannel shirt. Brian stated that he tried to intervene and even suffered injuries while struggling with the assailant. Troy, however, insisted he had never left the house and claimed he saw nothing. Despite their statements, investigators quickly suspected that none of them were telling the truth. Evidence found at the scene, including blood trails and the placement of the weapon, suggested a staged crime. Authorities believed the attack wasn't random, but instead carefully planned. The first night of the investigation was spent under the intense scrutiny of detectives who were left with one burning question. Why would someone target Chris? And which of the people present knew what really happened? Taylor Marks was born on March 29, 1989. Her biological mother decided to place her in foster care immediately after her birth, leaving the infant in the care of the adoption system. Little is known about her biological family, except that Taylor had at least one older sibling, though she was the only one placed in foster care. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, a chapter that, despite its challenging start, eventually brought warmth and care. A few months later, Taylor became part of the Marks family, Bruce and Chris Marks. The couple had long dreamed of having a child, as they were unable to have children of their own. When they first saw Taylor, they knew she was meant to be part of their family. At the time, the Marks family was financially stable. Bruce held a senior position at a major telecommunications company, while Chris, known for her organizational skills, managed the household and helped nurture their home life. They had a large and close-knit extended family, and Taylor was embraced with love. Relatives, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and many cousins, surrounded her with care and support. Bruce and Chris were deeply invested in raising Taylor. She attended prestigious private schools, participated in dance classes, and took part in other extracurricular activities. Her life was filled with opportunities that many of her peers didn't have. Taylor, however, shared a particularly close bond with Bruce. According to family friends, Bruce was her hero dad, always fulfilling her wishes and supporting her unconditionally. Her relationship with Chris, on the other hand, was different. Chris was stricter, more demanding, and practical. While these differences in parenting styles didn't cause significant issues during Taylor's early years, tensions began to emerge as she grew older. During her teenage years, Taylor faced increasing oversight and higher expectations from her mother, which became a frequent source of conflict. The family's dynamic began to deteriorate against the backdrop of growing disagreements. When Taylor was around 10 years old, Chris and Bruce faced marital issues that eventually led to their divorce. According to Taylor, her parents' separation deeply affected her emotionally. She felt that Chris began channeling her frustrations toward her, which further strained their relationship. A pivotal moment in Taylor's life came in 2002, when she was just 13 years old. Bruce passed away suddenly after falling into a diabetic coma. His death was a devastating blow for Taylor, who lost not only her father, but also her strongest source of emotional support. Shortly after, her grandfather, to whom she was also very close, passed away as well. These consecutive losses left Taylor with deep emotional wounds. Following Bruce's death, Chris inherited a substantial estate, including a large sum of money. She used part of the inheritance to purchase a new home in Akron, Ohio, hoping a scenery would provide a fresh start for her and Taylor. However, Taylor's emotional state continued to decline. She became more withdrawn, her academic performance suffered, and her conflicts with Chris intensified. Chris tried to support her daughter, but her methods often came across as overly controlling. She attempted to compensate for the loss of Bruce by providing Taylor with material comforts, often going above and beyond to give her everything she needed and more. However, the emotional connection between them continued to fade. Chris hoped her daughter would eventually take responsibility, finish her education, and one day carry on the family legacy. But Taylor had no interest in these plans, dreaming instead of breaking free from what she saw as imposed expectations. As Taylor entered her teenage years, her quest for independence clashed with her mother's expectations. This marked the beginning of escalating conflicts that only worsened over time. Taylor viewed her mother as a constant source of pressure. With each passing year, tensions grew. Chris tried to enforce strict rules to steer Taylor in what she believed was the right direction. She became increasingly worried about her daughter's declining grades, lack of focus on school, and apparent indifference toward her future. Taylor, however, saw her mother's actions as an attempt to control her life, fueling her desire to rebel. Chris's constant remarks about Taylor's appearance, choice of clothing, and selection of friends only widened the emotional gap between them. The high school years were particularly challenging. Taylor, with access to the privileges her mother provided, began using them irresponsibly. Instead of focusing on her studies, she preferred to spend time with friends, disregarding Chris's attempts to enforce discipline. Although Chris tried various methods to guide her daughter, they only deepened the divide. A critical turning point came in 2008, the year Taylor graduated from high school. Despite Chris's financial support and her willingness to provide opportunities for Taylor to attend any college, Taylor showed little interest in continuing her education. Chris pushed Taylor to at least try, and Taylor eventually enrolled at a university in Akron. However, just a month into her first semester, Taylor dropped out. For Chris, this decision was a major blow, symbolizing the growing distance and the stark contrast between their dreams for Taylor's future. Realizing that persuasion wasn't working, Chris decided to take a firmer approach. She gave Taylor an ultimatum: either get a job and start supporting herself, or move out of the house. This was a common expectation in American culture, where young adults are encouraged to take responsibility for their lives upon reaching adulthood. However, Taylor perceived her mother's words not as motivation, but as cruelty and a threat, deepening the conflict between them. The situation escalated further in May 2009, when Taylor met Brian Smith, a 21-year-old with a reputation as a bad boy. Brian lived in a low-income part of town with his mother and sister. Taylor was quickly drawn to him, seeing in Brian a chance to escape her mother's control. Those who knew Brian described him as having a hot temper and a need to dominate in relationships, but these traits didn't deter Taylor. Chris was strongly opposed to the relationship. She was concerned not only about Brian's behavior, but also about the influence he might have on her daughter. Chris attempted to forbid Taylor from seeing Brian, and even banned him from coming to their home. However, these actions only solidified Taylor's resolve. Before long, Taylor packed her belongings and moved in with Brian, leaving her mother's house. Life with Brian was far from the ideal Taylor had imagined. At first, their relationship seemed promising, but it didn't take long for Brian to begin displaying controlling and aggressive behavior. Taylor faced jealousy, control, and frequent outbursts of anger. Despite this, she refused to return home, seeing a move back as an admission of defeat. Concerned for her daughter, Chris continued to provide support. She purchased essentials for Taylor and maintained contact, hoping her daughter would come to recognize her mistakes. The tension between them reached a breaking point when Chris offered Taylor a lifeline. She could come home under the condition that she either resumed her education or found a job. Chris even proposed additional support, offering to provide her with a car, an apartment, and a position at her company. Yet, Taylor showed little interest in these opportunities. Her tumultuous relationship with Brian continued despite the mounting challenges. Chris held on to the hope that time would help Taylor see the error of her ways. She believed that one day her daughter would return home and take on more responsibility. Unfortunately, this hope would never come to fruition. The growing rift in their relationship, compounded over the years, set the stage for the events that would ultimately lead to a tragic outcome. Taylor's move to Brian's home marked the beginning of what she believed to be long-awaited freedom. However, that freedom quickly turned into a series of restrictions. Life with Brian proved far different from her expectations. He imposed strict rules and monitored every aspect of her life. Taylor, accustomed to a certain level of comfort and independence, found herself in an environment where she was expected to comply with Brian's every demand. Brian's control over Taylor soon became all-encompassing. He checked her phone, read her messages, and tightly monitored her movements. Even her communication with Chris became a point of contention. Brian convinced Taylor that her mother was merely trying to manipulate her and prevent her from living life on her terms. His words deepened the already growing divide between Taylor and Chris, who continued to reach out, determined to keep the lines of communication open. In Brian's home, Taylor found herself in complete isolation. Brian not only restricted her social connections, but also manipulated her emotions, portraying himself as the only person who truly understood her. During arguments, he displayed aggressive behavior, breaking objects, and making threats. His outbursts were often followed by demands for total loyalty and constant reminders of her on him. The situation was further complicated by the involvement of Brian's family. His mother, Tammy, chose not to intervene, effectively enabling his behavior. His younger sister also played a role in maintaining control over Taylor, acting as a watcher when Brian wasn't around. This created an environment where Taylor's every move was closely monitored. Taylor's financial ties to her mother were another critical factor in her relationship with Brian. Aware of Chris's wealth and Taylor's potential inheritance, Brian was determined to maintain control. He frequently reinforced the idea that her mother was the root of all her problems, further driving a wedge between them. Under Brian's influence, Taylor began avoiding contact with her mother. Even when Chris visited to help her daughter, Brian remained distant and dismissive. He discouraged Taylor from accepting her mother's support, insisting they could handle things on their own. Despite Brian's efforts, Chris continued to provide for Taylor, buying her necessities and urging her to come back home. By the summer of 2009, the tension between Taylor, Brian, and Chris had reached a breaking point. After months of living with Brian, Taylor had become entirely dependent on his influence. Amid increasing control and aggression, an idea began to take shape, something that initially seemed far-fetched but soon became a concrete plan. This idea was fueled by mounting pressure, mutual dissatisfaction, and financial motives. The plan was to remove Chris permanently, thereby gaining access to her assets. For Taylor, this seemed like a way to sever the last ties connecting her to her mother, while also achieving financial independence. For Brian, it was an opportunity to solidify his control over Taylor and use her inheritance to improve his own circumstances. The idea of committing a crime began circulating within their inner circle. Brian's 19-year-old friend, Troy Purdy, who frequently visited their home, became involved in these discussions. Younger and impressionable, Troy was seen as an ideal participant in the plan. Initially, the conversations were framed as jokes or hypothetical scenarios, but over time they became more serious. The planning progressed slowly, with careful attention to every detail. Brian and Taylor deliberated on how to stage the crime to look like a robbery or random attack. They decided that evidence left at the scene should point to an act of spontaneous aggression rather than a premeditated crime. Troy was chosen to carry out the act, distancing Taylor and Brian from any direct connection to the incident. Troy's involvement was based on his loyalty to Brian. He respected Brian and didn't question the plan when approached. In exchange for his role, Troy was promised $5,000, money that Taylor expected to receive from her inheritance once the legal processes were complete. Special attention was given to selecting the weapon. According to Taylor, Brian's mother, Tammy, even purchased a knife for the plan, but it was later deemed unsuitable due to its size and weight. Ultimately, Troy took on the task of finding an appropriate weapon. He chose a lightweight knife that was easy to conceal and carry. A critical part of the preparation involved studying Chris's routines. They knew Chris often visited Brian's house to see Taylor, making her vulnerable since she usually came alone, believing she was simply picking up her daughter. This detail was incorporated into the plan. The scenario envisioned Chris arriving at the house with the attack occurring as she exited the home or near her car. Just before the plan was set in motion, Taylor made the final move to ensure everything went as intended. She called her mother and asked her to come pick her up, saying she wanted to come back home. This phone call was designed to disarm Chris emotionally, giving her a sense of relief and lowering her guard. Throughout the discussions, Taylor showed no hesitation. According to Troy, she was not only an active participant in the planning, but also displayed a strong determination to see it through. Despite her strained relationship with her mother, taking such a drastic step was extreme. Taylor justified her involvement by citing years of built-up resentment and her desire to escape her mother's control. Brian, meanwhile, guided the process, convincing Taylor that this was the only way to resolve her problems. By the evening of October 24, 2009, everything was ready. Taylor knew the plan was moving from theory to action. She remained calm and focused, believing this was the only path forward. For Chris, this day seemed like the start of reconciliation with her daughter. For Taylor and Brian, it marked what they saw as the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. October 24, 2009, began as a typical day for Chris Marks, but ended in tragedy. That evening, Taylor called her mother and said she wanted to come home. For Chris, this unexpected phone call was a moment of joy. After months of tension, she saw it as an opportunity to reconnect with her daughter. She quickly gathered her things, got in her car, and drove to Brian's house, unaware she was walking into a meticulously planned crime. Chris arrived around 7 p.m. She parked her car near the house and walked to the front door. Taylor greeted her with a smile and hugged her, making it appear as though this was the first step toward reconciliation. Brian followed them out of the house, observing the scene from behind. As planned, Troy stayed inside to avoid drawing suspicion. Chris and Taylor began walking toward the car, with Brian trailing slightly behind, as though escorting them. It appeared to be in an instant. As the two women approached the car, Troy emerged from the house holding the knife. The attack began suddenly and without warning. Chris had no time to react. Troy struck her multiple times in the chest and face. The assault was swift and ferocious, leaving no opportunity for her to defend herself. Chris fell to the ground, having sustained more than 10 stab wounds. This was not a robbery. It was a targeted act of aggression meant to eliminate her. Taylor stood nearby, watching the attack unfold. She later claimed her inaction was due to fear of Troy. However, surveillance footage discovered later showed no signs of panic or distress on her part. Brian also remained passive, stating that his role was merely to protect the women. Yet he did nothing to stop Troy. Once the attack was over, Taylor picked up her phone and called emergency services. Her voice sounded tense as she begged for an ambulance to be sent immediately. However, the phone was soon taken by Brian, who assumed the role of coordinator, providing the dispatcher with details about the location and the type of assistance needed. His voice was calm and devoid of emotion, raising suspicions among law enforcement officers who later reviewed the call. Troy, after completing the attack, discarded the knife in a nearby bush and fled the scene. Later he claimed he acted in a moment of emotional distress, but the evidence suggested his actions were carefully planned. Chris was rushed to the hospital, but despite the medical team's efforts, she could not be saved. She succumbed to multiple stab wounds inflicted with evident fury. Following the tragic death of Chris Marks, the investigation began immediately. Police arrived at the scene just minutes after the call to emergency services. The evidence they found, a knife in the bushes, Chris's purse with all her belongings intact, and the absence of any signs of robbery, immediately raised doubts. The theory of a random attack didn't align with the details. The first step for investigators was to question those involved, Taylor, Brian, and Troy. They were interviewed separately to prevent any chance of coordination. Their accounts, however, were inconsistent and unconvincing. Police quickly noted discrepancies in their statements. The key piece of evidence came from surveillance footage captured near the crime scene. The video showed Taylor and Brian standing nearby as Troy attacked Chris. Neither of them made any attempt to intervene. These recordings became a decisive turning point. Armed with this evidence, detectives revisited the suspects for further questioning. Under the pressure of the evidence, Troy was the first to confess. He admitted that the attack had been premeditated and claimed Taylor was the mastermind behind the plan. According to Troy, she had approached him and Brian with the idea, promising a financial reward from the inheritance she would receive after her mother's death. Troy revealed that his role was to carry out the attack, while Brian was responsible for creating an alibi by making it appear like a robbery. Troy also admitted that he had intentionally inflicted minor wounds on Brian to make the staged scenario more believable. His confession completely dismantled Taylor's earlier claim that the attack was a random event. When Brian learned of Troy's confession, he altered his account as well. He corroborated Troy's statement that Taylor had initiated the plan. However, Brian denied being an active participant, claiming that while he didn't approve of the attack, he felt powerless to stop Taylor and Troy. He also insisted he was unaware of the full details of the plan until the last minute, though this seemed like an attempt to downplay his involvement. Confronted with mounting evidence and accusations, Taylor initially continued to deny her role. However, her version of events became increasingly inconsistent. Investigators noted that she began to contradict herself, and her behavior suggested she was attempting to hide the truth. Eventually, under the weight of the evidence, Taylor admitted to discussing the plan with Brian and Troy. The investigation uncovered numerous details that highlighted the deliberate nature of the crime. The participants meticulously planned every aspect, from choosing the weapon to staging fake injuries. The financial motive cited by both Troy and Brian became a central component of the prosecution's case. Taylor admitted that her ongoing conflict with her mother was a driving factor in her decision. However, she claimed she didn't anticipate the situation escalating to such a tragic outcome. Just 5 hours after the crime, police had a comprehensive understanding of what had happened. Taylor Marks, Brian Smith, and Troy Purdy were arrested and charged in connection with the death of Chris Marks. While this concluded the initial phase of the investigation, the legal process was just beginning as the court would determine their levels of culpability and issue sentencing. The trial for the crime involving Chris Marks began in late 2009. The defendants faced significant public scrutiny due to the brutal nature of the crime and the involvement of people close to the victim. The prosecution built its case on a wealth of evidence, witness testimony, and video recordings. The most compelling piece of evidence was the surveillance footage showing Taylor and Brian standing by and making no effort to intervene during the attack on Chris. Additionally, Troy's confession, which detailed the conspiracy and his role in the crime, became a cornerstone of the case. Investigators also presented text messages found on Taylor's phone where she had discussed her strained relationship with her mother and expressed a desire to be free of her. The financial motive was further supported by evidence of the substantial inheritance Taylor expected to receive after Chris's death. During the trial, it was revealed that Chris had significant assets, including real estate, a business, and substantial savings. Defense attorneys for Taylor, Brian, and Troy sought to mitigate their client's culpability. Taylor's defense argued that she was under Brian's significant influence and lacked the autonomy to act independently. Her lawyer claimed that the emotional instability caused by her father's death and the pressure from her mother made her vulnerable to manipulation. Brian, on the other hand, denied active involvement in the crime. His attorney argued that he was unaware of the plan until the attack occurred and was paralyzed by shock, unable to intervene. Meanwhile, Troy, despite his initial confession, attempted to partially change his story during the trial, claiming that he acted under pressure from Brian. During the proceedings, Troy agreed to a plea deal with the prosecution. In exchange for admitting his guilt and testifying against the other defendants, He received a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, avoiding the possibility of the death penalty. Taylor, realizing the hopelessness of her situation, also pled guilty. During the hearings, she delivered an emotional statement expressing remorse for her actions. She explained how her conflicts with her mother and Brian's influence had driven her to participate in the crime. However, prosecutors argued that her involvement was deliberate and calculated. Brian, in contrast, initially denied his guilt, but eventually admitted his role when confronted with irrefutable evidence. He maintained that his involvement was minimal and that he had not intended for the crime to occur, but the court viewed this as an attempt to downplay his responsibility. In 2010, the court delivered its verdicts. Taylor Marks and Brian Smith were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Both received life sentences without the possibility of parole. Taylor expressed remorse for her actions, but her claim that she had lost control was seen as an attempt to mitigate her sentence. Troy Purdy, as agreed in his plea deal, also received life imprisonment. However, his behavior in prison later drew attention. In 2015, he was charged with possession of a weapon within the facility, raising questions about his ability to reform. After the sentences were announced, the lives of everyone involved in the tragedy were irrevocably changed. The family of Chris Marks not only lost a mother, but also a daughter, who was complicit in her death. The story became a sobering reminder of how personal conflicts and impulsive decisions can destroy even the closest relationships. Taylor, sentenced to life without parole, was sent to a women's correctional facility in Ohio. During her first years in prison, she remained withdrawn, avoiding contact with the press and other inmates. However, in 2021, Taylor gave an interview to a television program about her case. In the interview, Taylor acknowledged the severity of her actions, but continued to justify her decisions by citing her conflict with her mother and her emotional instability. Despite her earlier expressions of remorse in court, Taylor reiterated criticisms of her mother, describing her as strict and unsupportive after her father's death. She also mentioned her hope of one day having her case reviewed and being granted a chance at freedom. Her statements sparked controversy, with many interpreting them as a lack of genuine remorse. Taylor now spends her days participating in rehabilitation programs and working within the prison. Her claims of repentance remain polarizing. Some view her as manipulative and insincere, while others see her words as an attempt to find meaning in life behind bars. Brian, also sentenced to life in a high-security prison, has maintained a low profile since his conviction. He has avoided interviews and has not spoken publicly about his role in the crime. According to prison staff, Brian has a reputation as a difficult inmate, prone to conflicts and aggression. His name resurfaced in 2017 when it was reported that he had been involved in a fight with another inmate. The incident underscored that his tendencies toward aggressive behavior had not diminished, even after his sentencing. Like Taylor, Brian remains a symbol of the tragic failure to take responsibility and the devastating influence one can have on others. Troy, who played a direct role in the crime, was also sent to a high-security prison. Despite his plea deal, his behavior behind bars demonstrated a lack of change. Troy has rarely been mentioned in the media since the incident. While his participation in the crime was viewed as the result of manipulation by Brian and Taylor, his willingness to deliver the fatal blows raised doubts about his capacity for rehabilitation. The memory of Chris Marks lives on among her friends and surviving family members. Her senior care business was sold after her death, with part of the proceeds donated to charities supporting victims of domestic aggression. Her relatives and friends have often described Chris as a strong and compassionate woman who dedicated her life to helping others. Years after Chris's death, her story continues to serve as a tale about the importance of open communication within families and seeking professional help when conflicts spiral out of control. Case 4. On February 28, 2021, successful businessman Tyler Pratt went to a meeting that was supposed to resolve his financial troubles. Accompanied by his girlfriend Jordan, he arrived in an industrial area on the outskirts of the city, where he was expected by some old acquaintances. A few hours later, law enforcement would find his lifeless body at that very spot. Jordan, miraculously surviving the incident, was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The only thing she managed to say before losing consciousness was two names that would shock not only her loved ones, but the entire country. Lucy Li was born in 1995 in Shenzhen, one of China's largest economic hubs. She was the eldest of three triplet sisters, born just minutes apart. Seeking a better life, her parents made the decision to leave China and settle in Canada, but they left their young daughters in the care of relatives. It would be 7 years before the family was reunited when the girls were finally brought to Toronto. Lucy's father, a determined and business-savvy man, started a driving school for immigrants, helping newcomers obtain their licenses. But the true financial success of the family came from her mother, Winnie Lee. Her financial firm, Respawn International, quickly established itself in the market. With a keen ability to navigate loopholes in tax regulations and manage capital efficiently, Winnie built a reputation as a powerhouse in the financial world. Over time, her influence grew so significantly that business magazines wrote about her, and her photos appeared alongside Canada's top politicians. The road to success came at a price, and the greatest sacrifice was the family itself. Winnie was hardly involved in raising her daughters, and when she did find the time, it was only to monitor their achievements. She demanded perfection in everything: academics, sports, intellectual, and artistic development. The sisters had to be fluent in multiple languages, play musical instruments, understand finance, and win competitions and academic contests. Mistakes and weaknesses were not tolerated. From an early age, Lucy did her best to meet these expectations, but she soon realized that her accomplishments were taken for granted. Her mother did not celebrate her successes; she saw them as the bare minimum. In this relentless pursuit of perfection, Lucy began to feel like an outsider in her own family. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in a small town in Slovakia, Oliver Carafa was born. His family was not wealthy, but his parents were determined to provide him with a good education and the opportunity to build a successful future. At the age of 8, he found himself in Canada, where his family had emigrated in search of new opportunities. Unlike Lucy, Oliver's childhood was not structured down to the last minute. He grew up free-spirited and independent, but as a teenager, he started drifting off course. He was drawn to risk and forbidden pleasures, constantly seeking the thrill that came with pushing boundaries. School didn't interest him, and he saw discipline as unnecessary. Lucy and Oliver's paths first crossed when they ended up at the same school. She was the model student, while he was the one who often pushed boundaries. Despite their differences, they formed a friendship. Oliver didn't feel the need to meet anyone's expectations, and that fascinated Lucy. To her, he was the first person who saw her as more than just a list of achievements. Over time, their friendship turned into a romance. It was the first relationship in Lucy's life that wasn't driven by expectations or family pressure. However, like many teenage relationships, it didn't last. They soon realized how different they were, and their visions for the future didn't align. After high school, they went their separate ways for good. Following her mother's plan, Lucy enrolled in a prestigious university's finance program. She was set for a career in the family business, a life of success and status. Oliver chose a different path. His love for risk and desire for fast money pulled him into a world that was difficult to escape. At 19, he got behind the wheel while heavily intoxicated. That night, his car crashed into a streetlight. One passenger lost their life on the spot, while another young woman suffered severe injuries. Oliver, however, walked away almost unscathed, but his life was forever changed. The court sentenced him to 5 years in prison and banned him from driving for 15 years. Years later, fate would bring him and Lucy together again. But this time, their reunion wouldn't be an innocent teenage romance. Now they would be bound by secrets, crimes, and a shared pursuit of a life that would always cost more than it seemed. Lucy enrolled in one of Canada's top universities, majoring in finance and global business. But the decision had never been hers. Her mother had already mapped out what fields her daughters would study, ensuring they would take on key roles in the family company. Lucy knew her education wasn't about self-discovery. It was just another stage in a plan she had never chosen. Throughout her university years, she was closely monitored and expected to deliver nothing short of excellence. Simply graduating wasn't enough. She had to do it with top honors. Every mistake was seen as failure, and even the slightest deviation from the plan brought her mother's disappointment. Lucy pushed herself relentlessly, earning academic awards, landing internships at top firms, and building the perfect resume. After graduation, she was immediately brought into the family business. Winnie expected her to integrate into the company's financial operations and gradually take on a leadership role. To the outside world, Lucy was the picture of success. But inside, she felt trapped. While Lucy lived in a world of strict discipline and career pressure, Oliver was serving his sentence, building new connections along the way. Among his cellmates were people involved in illegal businesses, stolen car operations, and various fraudulent schemes. They quickly recognized Oliver's appetite for risk and ambition. He listened, learned, and memorized the tactics they used to work around the law. These lessons would later help him establish his own ventures in the shadows. In 2019, after 5 years behind bars, he was released. But reintegrating into normal life was far more difficult than he had expected. With no formal education or legitimate work experience, legal income opportunities didn't offer the kind of money he wanted. On top of that, his driving ban stripped him of the freedom he had once taken for granted. During this time, he searched for a new path. He briefly attempted a career in modeling, hoping to use his looks as a source of income. His photos started appearing in small advertising campaigns. The money wasn't substantial, but it helped him build an image of success. That's when he turned his attention back to Lucy. They hadn't seen each other in years. Back in school, she had been a driven, ambitious student with a promising future ahead of her. But now she was different. Her social media was filled with photos from lavish parties, exotic vacations, and high-end restaurants. She had become a popular influencer, her follower count steadily growing, and brands were eager to collaborate with her. Oliver decided to reach out. Their conversation started with reminiscing about the past and soon shifted to their present lives. Lucy admitted that, on paper, she had achieved everything her mother had envisioned, but deep down, she didn't feel fulfilled. Her career had been built on other people's expectations. Oliver, in turn, painted a picture of himself as someone who had faced hardships but was now looking for a fresh start. A few days later, they met in person. Sitting across from each other at a restaurant, they talked about how much they had changed. Oliver appeared confident, speaking about new opportunities. Lucy listened, drawn to his sense of freedom. He wasn't bound by corporate structures or family-imposed rules. He lived on his own terms. Just weeks after reconnecting, Lucy made a decision that even she hadn't seen coming. She packed her things and moved in with Oliver. In an instant, she severed all ties to her past life, walking away from the future her mother had meticulously planned. She chose the unknown over the predictable. At that moment, she had no idea that this path wouldn't lead to freedom, but to disaster. Lucy's decision to leave her family came as a shock to her mother. Winnie wasn't used to defiance. Everyone in her circle followed the rules she set, and she expected the same from her daughters. When she found out that Lucy had chosen to be with Oliver Carafa, a man with a criminal record, her reaction was swift and severe. Overnight, Lucy's bank accounts were frozen, and any financial support was cut off. But Lucy didn't try to go back. On the contrary, this only strengthened her resolve to prove she could live without her mother's help. However, it didn't take long for her to realize that her independence was an illusion. Within weeks, it became clear that her influencer career wasn't generating enough income. She was used to a high standard of living, but now, financial stability depended entirely on Oliver. Unlike her, he wasn't worried. He confidently assured her that he had multiple sources of income, and that she had nothing to stress about. Oliver claimed he made money through investments, buying and selling cars, rare items, and other profitable deals. Lucy didn't ask questions. She wanted to believe it was really that simple. Gradually, she became more involved in Oliver's business. Since he was still banned from driving due to his past legal issues, Lucy became his full-time driver. At first, it seemed insignificant. She drove him to meetings, picked people up, and sometimes waited in the car while he handled business. Eventually, she noticed that their routes were always different, and most of their trips happened late at night. The first time Oliver asked Lucy to sign documents in her name, she hesitated. She was uneasy about the fact that the paperwork was tied to vehicles she had never seen before. He explained that it was just part of his business. He was involved in exporting and reselling cars for high-end clients. He assured her it was completely legal, just required certain workarounds. Lucy didn't argue. She signed documents, managed accounts, and assisted with transactions. While she believed she was simply helping with business operations, in reality, she had already become part of a criminal enterprise. Oliver was using her status to create the illusion of legitimacy in his deals, but she had yet to grasp just how deep she was in. Despite the instability of their financial situation, the couple lived in undeniable luxury. Their apartment was in an upscale area of Toronto. They switched cars every few months, and they never checked prices at restaurants. Designer clothing, jewelry, extravagant vacations, this was their new normal. Lucy didn't realize that she was becoming dependent, not just on Oliver's money, but on him entirely. He convinced her that they were a team, that without him, she wouldn't be able to maintain this lifestyle. She believed him, unaware that she was already teetering on the edge of disaster. In the spring of 2020, Oliver received an opportunity that could take his business to the next level. Through mutual connections, he was introduced to Tyler Pratt, a man who, at first glance, seemed like a typical successful entrepreneur. He owned several companies, including businesses in dietary supplements and investment projects. However, his real income came from a different source. Tyler was a key figure in Canada's illicit substance trade, handling large-scale imports and distribution. Tyler was looking for investment opportunities. After his divorce, he wanted to legitimize part of his assets and gradually transition out of the underground economy. He needed a reliable partner who could present a promising business venture. Oliver fit the profile perfectly. Young, ambitious, well-connected, and exuding confidence, Oliver arranged a dinner meeting with Tyler, where he pitched himself as an experienced player in logistics and international trade. He spoke convincingly about opportunities in commerce, investments in automobile imports, and real estate deals. But the main topic was his newest idea, supplying protective equipment. At that time, the world was in turmoil due to the pandemic. Governments, private clinics, and corporations were scrambling to purchase medical masks, protective suits, gloves, and other essential supplies. Oliver presented a project that, according to him, could generate millions. He planned to source protective equipment from Asia and resell it at marked-up prices in Western markets. It looked like a guaranteed win. Demand was skyrocketing, and suppliers were eager to work with cash transactions. Tyler was immediately drawn to the idea. He was a seasoned businessman, but when it came to legal markets, he lacked experience. Oliver assured him that he could manage the deals using his network. Convinced, Tyler made an initial investment of $200,000, expecting a quick return, double or even triple his money. Over the following weeks, Oliver maintained the illusion of progress. He provided his partner with fabricated reports of purchases, forged contracts with supposedly legitimate suppliers, and banking documents to confirm transactions. Tyler was certain his money was working for him. A month later, Oliver claimed that the project needed expansion and additional investment. He insisted that demand was growing, which meant there was an even bigger opportunity to profit. Caught up in the excitement, Tyler invested another $500,000. He had no idea that he had just signed his own death warrant. A few weeks after his second investment, Tyler started noticing alarming signs. He had transferred the money, but the protective equipment shipments never materialized. Oliver kept assuring him that everything was under control, but his excuses were becoming less convincing. He blamed logistical delays, customs issues, and bureaucratic red tape. Tyler wasn't naive. He understood how business worked and wasn't the type to let money disappear without answers. As his demands for documentation became more persistent, Oliver realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. Panic set in. Tyler wanted proof, and there was nothing to show him. Desperate, Oliver turned to Lucy. He explained that they needed to find a way to stall Tyler and buy some time. The only solution they could come up with was check fraud. Lucy took an old check from her mother's business records and attempted to withdraw over $1 million from the Lee family account. She was convinced that the money would get lost in her mother's financial transactions and go unnoticed. However, the bank flagged the transaction. A manager who was familiar with the Lee family noticed that Winnie's signature was missing and requested verification. As a result, the transfer was blocked. The plan had failed. Now Lucy and Oliver were trapped. Tyler no longer believed their excuses. He gave them an ultimatum. Either he got his money back, or there would be serious consequences. Oliver quickly realized that the only way to solve the problem was to eliminate Tyler. He discussed it with Lucy, but her reaction was conflicted. She knew they were in a desperate situation, but committing a crime seemed like crossing a line. However, Oliver insisted that they had no other choice. Tyler wasn't someone who forgave betrayal, and their lives could be at risk. The plan came together quickly. They invited Tyler and his girlfriend Jordan to a meeting under the pretense of discussing a new business opportunity. Oliver claimed he had found a way to recover the lost money. Tyler was skeptical, but decided to give Oliver one last chance. He agreed to meet. On February 28, 2021, around 6 p.m., Tyler and Jordan arrived at the designated location, a warehouse in an industrial area. They pulled up in their SUV, unaware that a trap had already been set. Oliver had meticulously prepared. He had purchased a used car with cash to avoid leaving a paper trail. They had also secured a disposable phone to communicate with Tyler. To further disguise herself, Lucy wore a wig to alter her appearance. As soon as Tyler stepped out of the car, Oliver pulled out a weapon. His first shots were aimed at Jordan. He knew that eliminating a witness would change the course of any future investigation. The bullet struck her in the chest, and she collapsed, losing consciousness. Tyler froze, realizing this was the end. Oliver didn't give him a chance to react. He turned the weapon on him and pulled the trigger without hesitation. Several shots rang out, and Tyler fell to the ground, instantly unconscious. Lucy stood nearby, not interfering, but fully aware that there was no turning back. In that moment, their lives changed forever. They weren't just con artists anymore. They had crossed into something far worse. Oliver quickly moved to check Tyler's SUV, making sure Jordan wasn't breathing. Seeing no signs of life, he left her body near the vehicle and told Lucy to leave. Certain that they had erased all witnesses, Oliver and Lucy left the warehouse, convinced that no one would be able to trace the crime back to them. But within an hour, something happened that they never could have predicted. At around 7:20 p.m., a truck driver passing through the area noticed someone lying near entrance of the warehouse. It was Jordan. Despite her injuries, she was still alive, and had managed to move just enough to catch the driver's attention. The man immediately called for emergency services. When paramedics arrived, they found that Jordan was still breathing. She was unconscious, but her pulse remained stable. No one knew how long she had been lying on the cold concrete floor, but one thing was clear. She had miraculously survived. She was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons performed emergency procedures to save her life. Law enforcement quickly assessed the scene. Inside the warehouse, they found Tyler's body. He had passed instantly from multiple gunshot wounds. There were no security cameras and no immediate witnesses, but the key to solving the case was lying in a hospital bed. As Jordan fought to stay alive, detectives launched their investigation. They combed through her call logs, messages, and recent movements. Within hours, they discovered that she and Tyler had been in contact with Oliver before the attack. Their meeting hadn't been random. It had been planned by the man who was now their prime suspect. At that moment, Oliver and Lucy had no idea their plan was falling apart. They watched the news, seeing headlines about an unknown assailant, convinced that everything had gone perfectly. But when the anchor mentioned that one of the victims had survived and was now in stable condition, their confidence turned to fear. Lucy froze, while Oliver started pacing the room. He knew that Jordan had seen their faces, heard their voices, and knew exactly who she had met that night. Once she regained consciousness, the police would have a full description of the attackers. Their only option now was to run. Oliver reached out to his contacts, people who could secure fake passports and arrange a safe exit. They had the money. A large sum stolen from Tyler was still sitting in their accounts. The only issue was time. Within hours, they met with individuals who had prepared their new identities. Lucy received a fake passport as a Philippine citizen, while Oliver assumed the identity of a Hungarian national. These documents allowed them to board a flight to Europe without raising suspicion. Their first stop was Prague. They chose it because it was a major transit hub, large crowds of tourists, fewer questions. They rented a short-term apartment, hoping to lay low and figure out their next move. The first few days passed relatively quietly. They avoided drawing attention, only going out when absolutely necessary. But the fear never left them. Oliver obsessively checked the news, waiting for the moment their names would be added to an international wanted list. Lucy barely spoke, haunted by the realization that they were no longer just con artists. They had crossed a line they could never erase. A few days later, they moved to Bratislava, then to Budapest. They believed that constantly changing locations would throw off any pursuit. In reality, they were only creating a longer trail for authorities to follow. Their false sense of security wouldn't last. Oliver was convinced the police wouldn't track them down so quickly. But within weeks, the situation shifted. International law enforcement agencies were now involved, and the net was closing in. What they didn't know was that their arrest was only a matter of time. While Oliver and Lucy attempted to disappear in Europe, Canadian authorities never stopped working. The first major breakthrough came from analyzing phone records. Investigators traced a SIM card used to contact Tyler, purchased just a day before the crime at a store in Toronto. Further investigation led detectives to one of Lucy's friends, who had unknowingly provided the suspects with an extra SIM card. During questioning, she revealed that it was Lucy who had asked for it. This became the first solid piece of evidence against her. The next breakthrough came from security footage. Investigators reviewed recordings from the area near the warehouse and discovered that hours before the attack, a vehicle registered under a fake identity had passed by. Inside, the silhouettes of the passengers bore a striking resemblance to Oliver and Lucy. Additionally, cameras near their apartment captured them leaving on the evening of February 28th and returning late that night. This further solidified the police's suspicions. Once Jordan regained consciousness, investigators got the confirmation they needed. She clearly remembered who had attacked them. Lucy and Oliver were identified as the perpetrators. That was enough for authorities to issue arrest warrants. Canadian law enforcement immediately shared the case details with Interpol, and within days, Oliver and Lucy were placed on an international wanted list. Their descriptions, photographs, and last known whereabouts were distributed to European law enforcement agencies. Meanwhile, the couple remained on the run, but their movements didn't go unnoticed. Hungarian authorities received the alert and began monitoring foreign travelers matching their descriptions. Soon, a critical mistake by Oliver brought their escape to an abrupt end. While paying rent for their apartment, he used falsified documents that raised suspicions. The landlord reported the unusual tenants, and their information was checked. When authorities confirmed they were fugitives on Interpol's list, a tactical unit was dispatched to their location. Oliver and Lucy had no time to react. They were arrested on the spot. Lucy attempted to claim it was a misunderstanding, but officers already knew exactly who they were taking into custody. Within hours, they were placed in a detention center, and extradition proceedings to Canada began. Their time on the run was over. Now they would have to face justice. By the spring of 2024, the trial of Lucy Lee and Oliver Carafa had drawn nationwide attention. The case became one of the most talked about in Canada. Two young individuals who had every opportunity for success had instead chosen a criminal path, one that ended in a deadly crime. The trial lasted several weeks. Prosecutors laid out a meticulously constructed case, presenting overwhelming evidence linking Lucy and Oliver to the crime against Tyler Pratt and the attempted crime against Jordan. Investigators provided call records, surveillance footage, financial transactions, and most crucially, the testimony of the surviving witness. Lucy's primary defense strategy was to shift the blame onto Oliver. She claimed she had no involvement in planning the crime, had no knowledge of Tyler's fate, and was simply a victim of manipulation. According to her, Oliver was in control, and she had merely followed him without fully understanding the gravity of the situation. However, the evidence told a different story. Prosecutors presented proof that Lucy had actively participated in the financial schemes, helped hide the stolen money, arranged the meeting with Tyler, and even attempted to forge financial documents. Her decision to flee and use a fake passport only strengthened the prosecution's case. Oliver, on the other hand, refused to testify. His defense team attempted to argue that the crime had not been premeditated, but was instead the result of a conflict. The court, however, rejected this argument. The final blow to Lucy's case came from security footage showing her deliberately concealing her face during her meeting with Tyler, as well as records proving that she had purchased the SIM card used to lure him into the trap. These pieces of evidence completely dismantled her version of events. The verdict was harsh, but expected. Oliver and Lucy were found guilty of the crime, fraud, and fleeing justice. Both were sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 25 years. The trial was over, but its impact lingered. Lucy, once living a life of luxury and privilege, now found herself in a prison cell. Oliver, who had thrived on adrenaline and risky ventures, had lost his freedom forever. Their downfall became a cautionary tale about how greed and the pursuit of easy money can lead to complete ruin. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Tyler Pratt as a victim, a man who trusted the wrong people and paid the ultimate price. His family and friends defended his character, emphasizing that he had been trying to leave his past behind and transition into a legitimate business. Others believed he had played a role in his own downfall. He knew who he was dealing with and willingly entered into a questionable financial arrangement. Lucy Lee became a symbol of wasted potential. Born into privilege, she had every opportunity to live comfortably without resorting to crime. But she chose a different path, one that led her away from her mother, into financial fraud, and ultimately to a deadly crime. After her arrest, her mother, Winnie Lee, refused to make any public statements. Her reputation in the business world took a hit, but she chose silence over damage control. Over time, she all but erased Lucy's name from her life, offering no support or defense. Oliver, however, was seen by many as a criminal whose fate had been inevitable. His troubled past and reckless choices had set him on this path long before the crime took place. For most, his conviction came as no surprise. This case destroyed multiple lives. Tyler lost his future. Jordan not only lost the man she loved, but, according to investigators, was pregnant at the time, making the tragedy even greater. What started as a scheme for easy money ended in devastation. In the end, everyone involved paid a price through lost lives, lost freedom, or lost fortunes. Case 5. March 23, 2019, 16-year-old Angela went to a gathering, promising her parents she would be back by evening. She was headed to a celebration among familiar faces, a place that seemed safe, where nothing unexpected should have happened. But as night fell, she stopped responding. Calls went unanswered, and the people who had spent the evening with her acted strangely, as if nothing had happened, or, on the contrary, as if they were trying to hide something. Late at night, her parents received a call that was supposed to explain their daughter's disappearance, but instead, it only led to more questions. Stories didn't match, details didn't form a clear picture, and every new fact contradicted the last. Those who had been with Angela struggled with their words. Some said too little, others too much. What really happened that night? Why didn't anyone start looking for her right away? What were the people around her hiding? This disappearance became a chain of mysteries, where every new answer only created more questions. Let's take a closer look at this case. Anela Aguirre was born in 2002 into a family filled with love and care. Her parents, Anel Daniel Aguirre and Yerlisha Aguirre, worked hard to provide their children with everything they needed. Her father, an engineer at a government company, was a strict but fair man who always prioritized his family's well-being. Her mother, a hairstylist, ran a small salon from home, where neighbors and sometimes even Anela's friends would stop by. Their home was never quiet. Laughter, conversations, and the sounds of everyday life created a warm and welcoming atmosphere that felt unshakable. Angela's older sister, Natalie, was more than just family. She was her closest friend. They shared secrets, talked about their future, and gave each other advice. In her free time, Angela enjoyed helping her mother in the salon. She loved experimenting with makeup, creating new looks, and sometimes doing manicures for her friends, who were always impressed by her skills. Angela had many friends. She was quick to connect with people, had a natural charm, and always knew how to lighten the mood. Energetic, cheerful, and kind-hearted, she was loved for her sincerity and openness. But despite her easygoing nature, she also had a thoughtful side. She often reflected on her future, what career to choose, and how to achieve success. Her parents taught their children the value of hard work, kindness, and helping those around them. Their home was a place where everyone felt welcome and supported. No one could have imagined that this warm and happy world would one day be shattered by a devastating tragedy. Jose Alberto Chedino came from a wealthy family. His father was a businessman, and his mother had strong connections in elite social circles. Because of this, he had access to privileges that most of his peers could only dream of. He had expensive possessions, exclusive club memberships, and the freedom to travel and enjoy luxuries that were out of reach for many. Angela met him through mutual friends. They started spending time in the same social circles about 3 years earlier. At first, she didn't pay much attention to him, but over time, their casual friendship became more frequent. For Angela, he was just a friend, someone to have fun with in a group setting. But Jose Alberto saw her differently. He was persistent. He frequently asked her to hang out, sent her messages, and always found excuses to be around her. But Angela never felt the same way. To her, he was just a friend, and his advances made her uncomfortable. Her close friends knew that he had asked her out multiple times, but she always turned him down. One evening, at a gathering with mutual friends, something happened that made Angela uneasy. While hanging out by the pool, her friends playfully pushed her into the water. Soaked, she asked Jose Alberto to help her find something dry to change into. At that moment, he suggested they go somewhere private, hinting at something more. Angela immediately refused. From that point on, she became more distant toward him, avoiding personal conversations. Over time, her discomfort around Jose Alberto grew. She confided in her friends, saying that he was becoming too persistent. They reassured her, telling her to ignore him. But Angela could sense that his interest wasn't fading. Even so, she continued to interact with him. Not because she wanted to, but because their social circles overlapped, making it difficult to completely avoid him. On March 23, 2019, Angela Aguirre woke up with excitement. That day, her best friend was celebrating a birthday, and she wanted to attend the party. She had discussed it with her parents in advance, but when it came time to ask for permission, she received a firm no. The reason was simple. Her friend lived in a neighborhood that wasn't considered safe, and her parents didn't want to put their daughter at risk. Angela tried to persuade them, offering to be driven there by car, but her mother and father remained firm in their decision. Disappointed, she messaged her friends, venting about her parents' strict rules. That same morning, she received a message from Jose Alberto Chidino. It was his birthday, too, and he invited her to celebrate with him. He suggested starting the night at a private club and then heading to La Taraquea Island, a secluded spot that could only be reached by boat. Angela hesitated. After being unable to attend the first party, this was her chance to still spend the evening with friends, and she decided to accept the invitation. But there was a problem. If she told her parents the truth, that the party would take place on an island, they would likely say no. So she chose to leave out some details. That evening, when she spoke to her parents about her plans, she reassured them that the gathering would be in a safe place. She emphasized that an adult chaperone, a relative of the birthday host, would be present, and that it would be a small, private event. Her parents hesitated, but after having already refused her earlier that day, they didn't want to disappoint their daughter again. They knew Jose Alberto and understood that they couldn't keep Anela completely isolated from her peers. After much convincing, her father agreed, but under strict conditions: no alcohol, frequent phone check-ins, and returning home at the agreed-upon time. As evening approached, Anela got ready for the night. She stood in front of the mirror, carefully choosing her outfit. At first, she considered wearing a dress, but then decided on something more comfortable: shorts and a light blouse, perfect for an outdoor party. She braided her hair neatly and applied light makeup. The drive to the club took about 15 minutes. Her father remained mostly quiet, but before they arrived, he reminded her once again, "If anything feels off, call me immediately." When they pulled up, a small group of people had already gathered outside the club. Anela couldn't enter without a chaperone, so she waited. A few minutes later, Jose Alberto arrived. He was relaxed, smiling, and greeted Anela without acknowledging her father. Before leaving, she quickly said goodbye, gave her father a kiss on the cheek, and walked away with her friend. It was the last time her parents would see her alive. When Anela met up with Jose Alberto outside the club, he suggested heading to La Taraquea Island almost immediately. The island, located in the middle of the Caroni River, was secluded and could only be reached by boat. He assured her that the real party was happening there, that their group was already gathered, and that they could have fun without any restrictions. He promised it was safe, that no strangers would be there, only people he trusted. He didn't give Anela much time to think. He told her the boat was already waiting, and that if she truly wanted to enjoy the night, she shouldn't say no. Her options were to either go along with the group or stay behind alone, which would have seemed strange to those around her. She chose to go. At the dock, the boat was waiting. The boat that would take them to the island belonged to Jose Alberto's godfather, Jose Zorilla. He was the oldest among them, a well-known businessman who, despite his age, maintained close ties with younger crowds and often hosted events like this. On board were several others: his son Bloomberg, Bloomberg's girlfriend Jocelyn Barrero, and two family friends, Orlando Salazar and Wilmer Diaz. All of them were significantly older than Anela. As the boat pulled away, leaving the city lights behind, the passengers laughed, talked loudly, and speculated about how the night would unfold. Bottles of alcohol were already being passed around freely, with no concern for moderation. La Taraquea Island was known as a party spot. There were no permanent structures, but it had been set up specifically for gatherings. A bar, a dance floor, and lounge areas had been arranged to accommodate large groups. It was a place where no one monitored what was happening. When the boat reached the shore, the group made their way toward the center of the island, where music was blasting, tables were set up with drinks, and the air was thick with the of alcohol and tobacco. The atmosphere was lively. People were dancing, others sat at tables, some were laughing, while a few already seemed intoxicated. The group quickly blended into the festivities. Drinks flowed freely, glasses were constantly refilled, and no one was keeping track of how much anyone consumed. Anela was surrounded by people. Someone was always raising a toast with her, pulling her into conversations, and encouraging her to enjoy the night. Time passed, the music grew louder, and the party showed no signs of slowing down. People moved between the bar and the dance floor, relaxed in lounge areas, and made plans for the rest of the night. At some point, Jose Alberto began staying closer to Anela. He made sure she was never alone, continuously engaging her in conversation and offering her more drinks. The night became increasingly chaotic, there was no structure, and no one was in control of what was happening. The group continued celebrating, losing track of time and their surroundings. People began dispersing throughout the island. Some kept dancing, others wandered off into the darkness. The party on La Terraquea Island lasted well into the night, becoming more disorganized as time passed. Guests moved chaotically, blending into the crowd. The music was deafening, alcohol consumption continued unchecked, and no one was paying attention to the time. In such a setting, it was difficult to track who was coming and going, who was talking to whom, or even who remained on the island. The last confirmed sighting of Anela was shortly before midnight. She had been moving between the dance floor, the bar, and the shoreline, socializing and drinking. Then, at some point, she vanished from sight. Several people later said that Anela might have just stepped away for some quiet time, away from the noise. This didn't raise any concerns at first, since guests frequently wandered off around the island, relaxed by the water, or found quieter spots. However, as time passed, it became clear that she was nowhere to be found. No one could pinpoint exactly when Anela disappeared, but at the time, no one made an effort to find out what had happened to her. Some partygoers claimed they assumed she had left early or taken a boat back with someone else, yet no one bothered to check if that was actually the case. No one searched the area, called out her name, or even sent her a message. By then, her phone was no longer responding, but no one took this as a sign of concern. At some point, the party started winding down, people were exhausted, the music had faded, and guests were gradually leaving. That's when it became evident Anela was missing. But still, no one actively looked for her. No calls were made to her parents, and no one reported that she had disappeared. Perhaps those present didn't want to draw attention or feared the consequences. Under the influence of alcohol, they chose not to dig too deep into the situation. Each person assumed someone else would handle it, but in the end, no one did anything. When the group finally decided to leave the island, no one stayed behind to search for Anela. Not a single person suggested waiting until sunrise, checking the area, or scanning the river. The boat, filled with the remaining guests, pulled away from the shore and headed back, leaving the dark, silent island behind. Anela Aguirre's parents were anxiously waiting for 8 p.m., the time they were supposed to pick her up from the party. Her father left early, driving to the parking lot of the club where Anela had said the gathering would take place. As soon as he arrived, he called her to let her know he was there. The phone rang, but there was no answer. He waited a few minutes and tried again. Same result. At first, he didn't panic. He assumed she might not have heard the call because of the music or had left her phone in her bag. He remained patient, glancing at the clock, but with every passing minute, his worry grew stronger. He kept dialing her number over and over, but she never picked up. After 30 minutes, he decided to call his wife to check if Anela had reached out to her. She answered with a worried voice, saying she hadn't heard from their daughter since she left the house earlier that evening. Realizing that Anela wasn't at the club, her parents started calling her friends, hoping someone could tell them where she was. However, none of them knew that she had never actually been at the club that night. Desperate for answers, they tried to get in touch with other party guests, but they couldn't find anyone who had useful information. They didn't understand what was happening, but they knew something was very wrong. Over the next few hours, they called Anela 56 times, but her phone remained unreachable. Around 2 a.m., their phone rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Her father picked up immediately, hoping to hear his daughter's voice, but instead it was Jose Alberto's mother. She uttered a sentence that felt like a nightmare. She fell off the boat. In that moment, Anela's parents' world collapsed. They had no idea what boat she was talking about. Anela had said she was at a party in a club. How could she have ended up on the water? They demanded an explanation, but the woman sounded hesitant, as if she herself wasn't entirely sure what had happened. Something didn't feel right. Their instincts told them that this situation was far more serious than they were being led to believe. Why were they only hearing about this now? Why had no one called earlier? If their daughter had fallen into the water, why hadn't anyone raised the alarm immediately? Every answer they received only deepened their fear. They knew something terrible had happened, but they had yet to realize just how devastating the truth would be. After receiving the late-night call from Jose Alberto's mother, Anela's parents knew their worst fears were coming true. They didn't know the full story yet, but one thing was clear. The situation was critical. Their daughter was missing, and no one had made an effort to find her. They clung to the hope that if they acted quickly, there was still a chance to save her. At 4 a.m., without wasting a second, they went to the police and demanded an immediate search operation. But instead of urgency, they were met with indifference. The officers on duty explained that officially, a person is not considered missing until 72 hours have passed, and until then, no active search would take place. They were told to wait. Maybe she had just lost track of time. Maybe her phone battery had died. Maybe she was simply out having fun and hadn't realized how late it was. But her parents knew better. They knew Angela would never disappear like this, and every passing moment without action meant losing precious time, time that could have saved her. This version of events seemed absurd to Angela's parents. Their daughter had never disappeared without warning, never kept her phone off for this long, and never broke her agreements with them. But the police weren't listening. Her parents knew that if they sat back and waited, precious time would be lost. So they took matters into their own hands. Her father's first move was to go to Jose Alberto's family home, demanding answers. He wanted to know who had been with his daughter, where she had last been seen, and who had actually witnessed her falling from the boat. But the responses he received were vague and evasive. Meanwhile, Angela's mother was calling all of her daughter's friends, hoping that someone could tell her where she had been at the moment she vanished. But no one even knew that she had been on the island. That confirmed their worst fear. Angela had intentionally kept her real plans a secret from everyone. Realizing that phone calls alone wouldn't be enough, the parents turned to social media for help. By 6 a.m., they began posting online, sharing their daughter's photo, her description, and the last known location where she had been seen. They begged anyone with information to come forward. The posts quickly spread, people shared them, sent messages of support, and some even volunteered to help in the search. Several people, after seeing the posts, recalled that they had seen a large group on the island the night before. They remembered young men and women partying, drinking, and among them, a girl who looked like Angela. At the time, no one thought much of it. Now, those sightings carried a much darker meaning. Angela's parents knew they couldn't wait for the authorities to take action. They went straight to the dock, where the boat had departed for the island. There, they tried to question staff about who had been operating the vessel, and whether any unusual activity had been reported. But once again, they were met with silence. It turned out that no one had been keeping track of the boat's trips that night. No patrols had recorded any departures after 5 p.m., even though nighttime travel on the water was officially prohibited. While the parents desperately searched for any clue, social media erupted. Angela's story gained massive attention, sparking outrage. People demanded answers, called for immediate search efforts, and flooded police pages with comments urging action. Despite the authorities' inaction, Angela's family pushed forward with their own investigation. They gathered a group of volunteers and started searching the riverbanks, knowing that every minute counted. But the truth they were about to uncover was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The search for Angela Aguirre lasted 3 days. However, on March 26th, all hope was shattered. At 7 a.m., local fishermen spotted a body floating near the riverbank, caught in the branches. It was found several miles upstream from the location where, according to the group, Angela had fallen from the boat. News of the discovery quickly reached the authorities. Soon after, an investigative team arrived at the scene, and within hours, Angela's parents received the confirmation they had been dreading. The body belonged to their daughter. The initial examination only raised more questions. Angela was still wearing a wetsuit and a life jacket, making the possibility of an accidental drowning highly unlikely. Official reports stated that if she had truly fallen overboard, the river's current would have carried her downstream. However, her body was found in the opposite direction, contradicting the laws of hydrodynamics. This meant she could not have drowned in the location described by the witnesses. The first forensic analysis revealed multiple signs of physical trauma. Bruises and lacerations were found on her head and face, indicating severe blunt force impact. Additionally, there were indications of aggressive assault. The official cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation due to drowning, but the report suggested she may have been unconscious before entering the water. Angela's parents were devastated. They had known something was wrong, but could never have imagined the full extent of the horror. The authorities remained slow to comment, and the police avoided giving direct answers. However, the Aguirre family refused to stay silent. They made a public plea, demanding justice and accountability for those responsible. Meanwhile, as news of the forensic findings spread across social media, public outrage erupted. Many people began to suspect that there was an effort to cover up the case and protect those involved. But Angela's family was determined to fight for the truth. The first forensic report following Angela Aguirre's discovery left little room for doubt. She had suffered physical trauma, sustained head injuries, and lost consciousness before drowning. However, these findings quickly became inconvenient for certain individuals. Just 2 days after the autopsy results became public, authorities announced a second forensic examination. This time, the conclusions were completely different. The new report stated that there were no signs of foul play, and that all injuries had supposedly occurred in the water due to impact with rocks. The official cause of death was revised to an unfortunate accident. The findings suggested that Angela had fallen into the water on her own, and that her life jacket may have malfunctioned. This conclusion sparked widespread outrage. Angela's parents didn't believe a single word. They couldn't accept how the official version of events had completely changed within just a few days. How could the injuries on her body be explained? Why did the first forensic report confirm aggression, while the second one dismissed it entirely? But the biggest question, one being asked not just by the family but by the entire country, was, how could someone wearing a life jacket drown? There were no answers. Angela's parents openly accused the authorities of corruption. They claimed that someone was protecting those responsible by using their influence and power. They demanded an independent investigation and a new forensic analysis conducted by international experts. At the same time, social media erupted with renewed outrage. People were convinced that there had been an attempt to cover up the case, that powerful figures had intervened to make the evidence disappear. The protests were no longer limited to the online space. Public pressure was building. Angela's parents refused to back down. They knew they weren't just fighting for their daughter, but for the countless other families whose cases had been left unresolved in a system plagued by corruption and impunity. The overwhelming attention surrounding the case drew the interest of journalists. Independent media outlets launched their own investigations, publishing reports exposing corruption within the Venezuelan justice system. Discrepancies in witness statements, suspicious alterations in documents, and the unexplained disappearance of key evidence were all brought to light. The tipping point came when a major independent news outlet published explosive findings. The families of the suspects had allegedly attempted to bribe the legal system. Evidence suggested that $100,000 in cash and 3 kilograms of gold had been offered in exchange for closing the case. This revelation ignited public fury. People demanded resignations, arrests, and justice. The protests were no longer just digital. Citizens took to the streets. Angela's case was no longer just a tragic story. It had become a symbol of the fight against corruption and impunity. After months of relentless public pressure, Angela Aguirre's case finally reached the courts. But Venezuelan authorities made an unusual decision. The trial would be held in secrecy. Journalists, activists, and even the victim's family were denied access to the proceedings. From the start, it was clear that the pressure on Angela's family was intensifying. Her parents began receiving threatening phone calls and warnings that they should stop stirring things up. Anonymous messages were sent their way, and strangers were spotted lurking near their home. Despite all obstacles, the trial took place. In the end, Jose Alberto Chedino and his godfather, Jose Zorilla, were sentenced to 29 years in prison. The court found them guilty of aggression and criminal actions, but the most shocking part was something else. Every other guest at the party was fully acquitted. None of them faced any consequences for covering up the crime or failing to act when Angela disappeared. This verdict sparked a new wave of public outrage. People demanded real justice, arguing that it was impossible for the crime to have been committed by only 2 individuals. Angela's parents appealed the decision, but the court refused to reconsider their arguments. The trial ended, but justice never truly prevailed. The sentencing of Jose Alberto Chedino and Jose Zorilla did not bring closure. Instead, it raised even more questions. Angela Aguirre's parents could not accept that the other guests had walked free. They were convinced that more people were responsible, but the system chose to close the case and act as if justice had been served. Immediately after the verdict, the family filed an appeal, demanding a new investigation, and for all those present on the island that night to be held accountable. They pushed for additional interrogations and access to classified case materials, but their efforts were met with resistance. The judicial system showed no urgency in reopening the case, and key pieces of evidence that could have implicated others had either disappeared or were ignored. Too many inconsistencies remained. Why was Angela's body found in a location that didn't match the supposed accident? How could she have drowned while wearing a life jacket? Why didn't her friends search for her immediately? Who actually caused her injuries? What exactly happened that night? These questions were left unanswered. Months passed, yet the case remained at a standstill. Angela's parents continued their fight for the truth, but they were met with endless refusals and closed doors. And the more the authorities tried to bury this case, the more people became convinced. The full truth had never been revealed. Case 6. Elisa Maria Claps was born on January 21, 1977 in the small mountainous town of Potenza, located in southern Italy. She was the youngest of 3 children in her family. Her mother worked as a simple clerk, and her father owned a small tobacco shop. Elisa grew up alongside her 2 older brothers, Gildo and Luciano. The Claps family was known for being strict and deeply religious, attending Sunday services together every week at their local church. Elisa was a bright and ambitious student who dreamed of becoming a doctor, driven by her desire to help others. People who knew her described her as incredibly kind, compassionate, and friendly. At the same time, she was innocent and trusting, always believing the best in others. She had an effortless way of connecting with people and making friends quickly. By the time she turned 16, Elisa had never been in a romantic relationship, despite the attention she received from her peers. With her warm smile and long, beautiful hair, she was certainly noticed by the boys at school. Yet, coming from a religious household, she politely declined all invitations to go on dates. A disturbingly persistent admirer. In early summer of 1993, a local man named Danilo Restivo began showing persistent and unwanted interest in Elisa. Danilo was 5 years older, and unsettling rumors about him circulated through the town. Elisa tried to keep her distance from this peculiar individual, who often attempted to lure her into isolated places whenever he had the chance. Her upbringing and natural kindness made it difficult for her to be harsh or dismissive, and Danilo seemed to misinterpret her politeness as encouragement. Elisa wrote about Danilo in her personal journal, admitting that he frightened her, but also evoked a strong sense of pity. She noted how he appeared lonely and troubled, which is why she always made an effort to be courteous, even though she was careful never to be alone with him. Whenever she interacted with him, she found an excuse to leave as soon as possible, often claiming she had important errands to run. In mid-August that year, the Claps family went on a vacation to Monte Giordano, a quiet seaside town. One day, while strolling through the peaceful streets with her brother Gildo, Elisa suddenly froze. Danilo was approaching them, and she gripped her brother's hand tightly, signaling him not to leave her side. Danilo greeted Elisa as if they were old friends, and even insisted he needed her assistance with something, asking her to come with him. Gildo immediately sensed something was wrong. Making up an excuse, he led his sister away. Later, he asked Elisa why she had reacted that way, and whether Danilo had hurt her. Elisa confessed that the man had been following her and that she was terrified of him, even though he had never harmed her physically. On September 11th, at around 5 p.m., the Claps family's phone rang. Elisa answered, and her demeanor quickly changed as she spoke to the person on the other end. Her expression became increasingly somber and agitated, which did not go unnoticed by her brother. When Elisa hung up, Gildo asked who had called. She admitted that it was Danilo. When Gildo offered to confront him, Elisa firmly refused, insisting she could handle it herself. She didn't want to create trouble for anyone, and believed she had everything under control. The mysterious disappearance at church on Sunday, September 12, 1993, Elisa's parents and brothers left early for a day trip to Naples, located about 90 miles from Potenza. Elisa had stayed behind, planning to attend morning service at the local church with her close friend, Elena. The plan was for both girls to head back to the Claps home for lunch afterward. At around 10:30 a.m., Elisa left her house and headed toward the church. By noon, her family had returned from Naples, and her mother prepared lunch while everyone waited for Elisa and Elena. But as time passed, the girls still hadn't come home. At 1:45 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Elena stood on the doorstep, looking anxious. She asked if Elisa had come back yet, explaining that they had gotten separated at the church and lost sight of each other. Elena said she assumed that Elisa had gone ahead to her house, but her story seemed shaky, and she fidgeted uncomfortably, as if she were hiding something. When the family told her that Elisa was still missing, Elena became even more distressed. Under pressure, she finally admitted that she hadn't been honest. In reality, Elisa had stayed behind to speak with a young man after the service. It was supposed to be a brief conversation, no longer than 10 minutes, and the two girls had arranged to meet afterward at the park before heading to lunch. But Elisa never showed up, neither after 10 minutes nor after an hour. As the conversation went on, Elena reluctantly revealed that the young man Elisa planned to meet was named Danilo. Hearing this, Gildo's face grew pale. He immediately warned his parents and brother that Elisa could be in serious danger and that they needed to start searching for her right away. Who is Danilo Restivo? Danilo Restivo was born on April 3, 1972, in Eris, a small commune in the Trapani province on the island of Sicily. He was the youngest child in a relatively wealthy family. Growing up, he was spoiled and accustomed to getting whatever he wanted, learning early on that he would never face real consequences for his behavior. His father always came to his defense, no matter what trouble he caused. In the early 1980s, the Restivo family moved to Potenza, where Danilo's father Maurizio established a highly successful business. Within a few years, Maurizio became one of the city's wealthiest and most influential figures, forging strong connections with local law enforcement and government officials. During his school years, Danilo was known for being odd, rude, and disturbingly aggressive. He was a withdrawn and cruel child, infamous for mistreating animals, a behavior that seemed to give him a twisted sense of satisfaction. He also had a troubling obsession with sharp objects. Danilo was repeatedly caught spying on girls in locker rooms, and no amount of intervention or punishment seemed to deter him. He continued these behaviors with a stubborn, almost compulsive determination, showing no remorse or desire to change. Danilo Restivo was a loner, largely avoided by his peers, and had no real friends. He had an unnerving habit of carrying scissors with him everywhere, and would often cut locks of hair from unsuspecting girls. Despite multiple complaints from parents, this disturbing behavior went unpunished. Danilo would take his trophies home, amassing a sizable collection of hair clippings. His family, oddly enough, seemed to dismiss this behavior as mere childish mischief, failing to see any red flags. As Danilo grew older, his behavior became increasingly alarming. His cruelty extended beyond mistreating animals. He seemed to crave causing pain to people. He continued to struggle with social interactions, particularly with girls, toward whom he often displayed aggressive tendencies and attempts to intimidate or hurt. The first victim, Danilo, had a younger cousin named Sonia, who was about a year and a half his junior. They attended the same school and often walked home together after classes. Danilo would frequently invite her to secluded areas, coming up with various excuses to lure her away. However, Sonia was wary of her cousin. Her instincts told her to be cautious, and her mother had explicitly warned her never to go anywhere alone with him. In the spring of 1987, Danilo finally managed to convince Sonia to follow him, promising to show her a secret hideout. Sonia, sensing something was off, decided to bring her 11-year-old younger brother, Angelo, along for safety. After school, the three of them ventured into a wooded area where an old, abandoned shack stood. Danilo suggested playing a game that involved blindfolding the participants. Trusting him for a moment, Sonia and Angelo agreed, and Danilo tied blindfolds over their eyes. A tense silence followed. Growing uneasy, Sonia adjusted her blindfold slightly to peek and saw something terrifying. Her cousin pulling a pair of scissors out of his backpack and moving toward Angelo, preparing to strike. Sonia screamed as loudly as she could, startling her younger brother. Angelo, who still had his eyes covered, reacted instinctively, jerking away, just as Danilo's hand swung downward. Instead of landing on his neck, the scissors slashed his shoulder. The sight of blood and Sonia's piercing screams seemed to stun Danilo, giving the children the precious seconds they needed to escape. Sonia and Angelo bolted from the shack, their screams echoing through the woods as they ran for their lives. Danilo chased after them, shouting threats and demanding they keep quiet about what had happened. Driven by sheer terror and the instinct to survive, Sonia and Angelo managed to outrun him, making it to safety. The parents of the injured children were horrified by what had happened. They rushed Angelo to the hospital, where doctors managed to provide life-saving care just in time. The boy had lost a significant amount of blood and came dangerously close to losing his life, but he ultimately survived. That very day, the parents filed a report with the local police, pressing charges for attempted assault with deadly intent. However, the case was swiftly swept under the rug, and Danilo faced no real consequences. Rumor had it that his father used his considerable influence to protect his youngest son. Mr. Restivo, with the support of a local priest, promised Angelo's family that Danilo would be sent to a psychiatric facility for mandatory therapy to prevent any future incidents. Additionally, he covered Angelo's medical expenses and paid the family a substantial sum in compensation. Not long after, Sonia and Angelo's parents decided to move their family to Naples to escape any further contact with their dangerous relative. Despite his solemn promises, Danilo's father never followed through on his pledge. Danilo was not sent for treatment and never even saw a specialist. Mr. Maurizio Restivo was too concerned that a formal psychiatric evaluation might label his son as mentally unstable or a danger to others, which would irreparably damage his own reputation and social standing. A dangerous favorite, Danilo was expelled from 4 different schools due to repeated complaints from students and parents about his aggressive and threatening behavior. In the end, he had to resort to homeschooling in order to complete his education and earn his diploma. At 18, Danilo was called up for military service, as he was technically deemed fit to serve. Yet, within just a few months, he was discharged because of his erratic and unpredictable actions. Returning home, he continued to live under the protection of his wealthy and powerful father, who kept shielding him from accountability. Over time, Danilo's behavior only grew more disturbing. He would stalk girls he was infatuated with, spy on them through their windows, make creepy late-night phone calls in which he stayed silent, and subject them to unsettling harassment. His attempts to express romantic interest often escalated to aggressive behavior, such as trying to cut off locks of their hair or luring them to deserted locations. When these girls rejected his advances, Danilo responded in alarming ways, sending them packages containing fake explosive devices labeled with words like boom or letters detailing his unsettling fantasies. No amount of complaints to the authorities seemed to make a difference, as Danilo's father always stepped in to protect him. With this constant cover-up, Danilo felt invincible and beyond the reach of the law. To outsiders, he appeared relatively harmless, more like a local oddball than a manipulative or dangerous individual. This deceptive appearance is what evoked pity in people like Elisa, who felt a sense of compassion for him and even wished she could help. The search for the missing girl leads to the church. Elisa's parents and brothers wasted no time in launching a desperate search. Their first stop was the local church, where she had last been seen. According to her friend, Elisa had planned to confront Danilo Restivo that day to ask him to leave her alone and stop seeking her out. Several witnesses were quickly found who confirmed seeing the high schooler talking to Danilo outside the church, but none of them could say where the two had gone afterward. Elisa's mother attempted to call the Restivo household, hoping to speak with Danilo. However, Danilo's father, Maurizio, answered the phone and refused to let her speak with his son. Growing increasingly alarmed, the Claps family drove to the Restivo residence, but no one came to the door. Running out of options, they contacted law enforcement to report Elisa as missing. When officers arrived at the Restivo house, they were met by Maurizio, who claimed that his son had left for Naples on some errands and wouldn't be back until the following day. Yet, it wasn't long before authorities discovered Danilo was actually at home. Returning to the house, the police insisted on speaking with Danilo and brought him to the station for questioning. They had to do so because his father repeatedly interfered, making it difficult to get clear answers. Danilo's story was full of inconsistencies. He admitted he had spoken with Elisa at the church, but claimed she had left soon afterward, while he remained there to pray. His account was vague and riddled with contradictions, and his visible anxiety made it clear he was not being honest. Danilo couldn't account for his whereabouts after leaving the church and couldn't produce the clothes he had been wearing that day, which he appeared to have gotten rid of. Investigators also discovered a pair of his shoes soaking in a tub filled with bleach, where they had been left for nearly 2 days. Naturally, any potential traces of blood had been destroyed. Detectives also noted a suspicious cut on Danilo's hand, which he couldn't adequately explain. He claimed he had tripped and cut himself on something sharp while walking away from the church, but he was unable to specify the location of the incident. Moreover, the wound appeared to have been inflicted by a sharp blade, which made his story even less credible. The prosecutor protects the suspect. Despite Danilo's evasive behavior, refusal to provide his clothes and shoes for analysis, and his tangled web of inconsistent statements, his father acted swiftly to defend him. Maurizio immediately hired two of the best defense attorneys from Naples to represent his son. Faced with these obstacles, the police handling the case sought permission from the city's chief prosecutor to obtain a warrant. They needed legal authority to search the suspect's home and to seize his clothing and footwear, hoping to find any evidence that could link him to Elisa's disappearance. Despite overwhelming evidence pointing toward Danilo's involvement in the disappearance of the young girl, the city's chief prosecutor displayed a surprising level of indifference. He refused to issue a search warrant for Danilo's home or the church where Elisa was last seen. The search of the church was only a superficial one, and the main priest, Father Domenico Sabia, adamantly denied access to the locked upstairs room, which was secured by a wooden staircase and padlocked. Even when pressured, the prosecutor declined to grant a warrant to thoroughly investigate the church and its adjoining rooms. Suspiciously, Father Domenico spoke of Elisa in the past tense from the beginning, almost as if he already knew she was no longer alive. 3 weeks after Elisa's disappearance, the case made local news, with a segment highlighting Danilo as the prime suspect and displaying his photograph. Following this broadcast, the police station received dozens of calls from women who described being stalked and harassed by Danilo. They revealed that he had a disturbing obsession with women's hair and was known to carry scissors, attempting to discreetly cut off strands of hair from unsuspecting victims on city streets, in parks, and even on public transportation. Thanks to the perseverance of dedicated investigators, they finally managed to charge Danilo with providing false statements in the spring of 1995. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. However, he served less than 2 months behind bars before his sentence was commuted to community service, ironically at the very same church where Elisa had disappeared. A new prosecutor and a fresh investigation. The investigation into Elisa's disappearance stalled until 1999, when police arrested the organization. Although he knew nothing about Elisa's case, he divulged damning information about the city's chief prosecutor. According to him, the prosecutor was involved in corruption, accepting bribes, covering up crimes, and intentionally derailing investigations when asked. While these allegations were considered hearsay, and the informant was later charged with defamation, they prompted a significant change. A new prosecutor and lead investigator were assigned to Elisa's case, and they essentially started from scratch. This time, they were finally granted a search warrant for Danilo's house. Although the specific clothing and shoes he had worn on the day of Elisa's disappearance were nowhere to be found, the search uncovered something alarming. Danilo had amassed a substantial collection of hair strands from numerous girls, carefully kept in his room. Under Danilo's bed, investigators found a large box filled with photographs of nude and semi-nude women. He had taken these photos himself, spying on his victims in locker rooms, fitting rooms, showers, and even through the windows of their homes. Disturbingly, he also kept a separate set of images depicting women with amputated limbs. It was clear that he had serious psychological issues, but none of this provided any new leads in the case of the missing Elisa collapse. When police tried once again to search the church 6 years after Elisa's disappearance, Father Domenico remained adamant about not allowing them to access the locked upstairs room. He went to great lengths to prevent the search, leveraging his connections and framing the investigation as an attempt to desecrate a sacred space, even rallying churchgoers against the officers. The move and a letter from the beyond with no solid evidence against Danilo. Even after the renewed investigation, he eventually left his hometown and embarked on an extended journey through Europe. He continued to stalk women, cutting their hair whenever he had the opportunity. However, without his influential father's protection, he had to be more cautious. If his actions risked legal consequences, Danilo would quickly relocate to another city or even another country. In the early 2000s, the Claps family received an unexpected letter, supposedly written by Elisa herself. The message claimed she was alive, well, and had run away with a romantic partner, with whom she was now living in Brazil. The writer asked her family not to look for her or try to make contact. But the handwriting was unmistakably different from Elisa's. Anyone could see the discrepancy just by comparing it to her school notebooks and personal diary. Furthermore, The letter was riddled with glaring grammatical errors, suggesting that whoever wrote it was poorly educated. The Claps family conducted their own investigation, and, unsurprisingly, their suspicions led straight to Danilo. He had been visiting his parents at the time, and had somehow decided to fabricate the letter, pretending to be Elisa in a failed attempt to mislead her loved ones. A new victim on November 12, 2002, the quiet British town of Bournemouth was rocked by the brutal crime that claimed the life of 48-year-old Heather Barnett. Her 2 teenage children made the horrifying discovery after returning home from school. Heather's lifeless and mutilated body was found on the bathroom floor, lying in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slashed, and her skull showed signs of multiple blunt force trauma, likely inflicted with a hammer. The most disturbing aspect of the crime, however, was that her breasts had been removed and placed beside her head. In Heather's hand was a lock of hair that did not belong to her. This hair had not been ripped out in a struggle. It had been neatly cut with scissors. Additionally, some of Heather's own hair had also been trimmed. These eerie details suggested that the crime might have been ritualistic in nature. Investigators soon turned their attention to Heather's peculiar neighbors, Fiamma Marsango, and her husband, Danilo Restivo. The couple lived next door, separated only by a thin wall from the victim's home. Heather had filed several complaints about Danilo, who had made unwanted advances toward her despite being married. Just before the crime, she confided in a friend that she was afraid of him. Heather worked as a seamstress, taking in custom orders from her home. Danilo often tried to visit her under the pretense of commissioning clothes. He never placed any specific orders, but was insistent on coming inside to discuss details. 2 days before the tragedy, after one of Danilo's visits, Heather realized her house keys were missing. She didn't connect this to her neighbor at the time, thinking she had simply misplaced them. Unfortunately, she hadn't yet gotten around to changing the locks. Danilo was one of the first people at the scene, arriving even before the police and emergency responders. He claimed he had been returning home when he heard the terrified screams of Heather's children and rushed over to help. Although officers brought him in for questioning, they quickly released him, as he came across as clumsy and harmless. However, Heather's children pointed to him as a person of concern, revealing that they also felt uneasy around their strange neighbor and mentioned the missing keys after his most recent visit. With no immediate grounds to search Danilo's home, the police decided to keep a close watch on him. It wasn't long before they caught him in an unsettling act. Danilo was found on the street, scissors in hand, stalking a young woman and attempting to snip a lock of her hair. Officers detained him, asked for his identification, and conducted a search of his vehicle. In the trunk, they found a disturbing collection, a set of knives, a change of clothes, and extra pairs of shoes. This, combined with his suspicious behavior, finally provided enough evidence to obtain a warrant to search his house. Investigators got a shocking surprise when they searched Danilo Restivo's home. They found several albums filled with locks of hair that he had cut from various women. In the bathroom, clothes and sneakers were soaking in a bleach-filled tub, but the most damning piece of evidence was Heather Barnett's missing keys, now lying in Restivo's room. While blood traces were found on the clothing, the bleach had damaged the samples so severely that they couldn't be identified. However, Danilo's DNA was discovered on a towel in Heather's bathroom, suggesting he had wiped blood spatter from his face with it. A body in the church attic, and 2 convictions. As the investigation into Heather Barnett's murder continued, authorities uncovered Danilo's disturbing past. 9 years earlier, he had been the prime suspect in the disappearance of a high school girl in his hometown. At the time, investigators had failed to find enough solid evidence, and the girl's body had never been located. But now, with substantial proof of his violent behavior and no influential father to shield him, Danilo was tried, found guilty of premeditated murder, and sentenced to 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Then, in March 2010, 17 years after Elisa Claps had gone missing, construction workers discovered her mummified remains in the attic of the same church where she had last been seen. Her body had been hidden behind the locked door that Father Domenico Sabia had refused to open to police. By this time, Father Domenico had long since passed away, and his exact role in covering up the crime could never be fully determined, though it was clear he had harbored a terrible secret. Elisa's body showed chilling similarities to Heather Barnett's case. Her chest had been mutilated in the same way, and the cause of death was a slashed throat. Additionally, her undergarments had been disturbed, suggesting a violent, intimate assault. Fingerprints were recovered at the scene, and bloodstains on Elisa's decayed clothing matched both her and Restivo, who had injured himself during the attack. In Elisa's hand was a lock of hair that didn't belong to her, an eerie signature mirroring the evidence from Heather's murder. Restivo was tried in absentia for the murder of Elisa Claps, as he was already serving his 40-year sentence in the UK. With overwhelming evidence, he was convicted again, this time receiving a 30-year prison sentence for the crime. Once he completes his sentence in the UK, he will be extradited to Italy to serve an additional 3 decades for the horrific assault on Elisa. Authorities suspect that Restivo may have had many more victims, but his involvement in other unsolved murders and disappearances remains unproven. Case 7. Relationships walk a fine line between trust and danger. Sometimes they begin with passion and mutual admiration, moving forward in an exhilarating whirlwind, but over time, cracks start to appear. The first warning signs are easy to dismiss, written off as bad timing, stress, or exhaustion. When two people come together, they don't just bring themselves into the relationship, they carry their past experiences, fears, and hidden struggles. For some, this bond becomes a source of strength. For others, it leads to destruction. Today, we're exploring a complicated case that started as a romantic connection, but ended in a tragic crime. A story of passion, illusion, dependence, and fatal mistakes that came at a devastating cost. How did an ordinary introduction spiral into a nightmare? When did things go too far? And could anyone have prevented what was coming? To understand what happened, we need to go back to where it all began. Erlene Cardelize was born in 1991 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She grew up in a loving family, surrounded by the care of her parents and sisters. She was naturally outgoing, had an easy time connecting with others, and was known for her ability to listen, support, and bring positivity into people's lives. From a young age, Erlene was curious and eager to explore different fields, but she was especially drawn to science and health. She enrolled in college to study biological sciences, hoping to build a career in medicine or research. However, after graduation, she realized that working in a lab or an office wasn't the path for her. Craving change, she made a bold decision. She moved to Las Vegas. A city known for its endless opportunities and fast-paced lifestyle, Vegas wasn't just a new place to live. For Erlene, it was a fresh start. Shortly after moving, she became deeply invested in fitness. Within months, her physical transformation was dramatic. Not only did she become stronger, but her confidence skyrocketed. This newfound passion led her to pursue certification as a personal trainer, determined to help others reach their goals. Her career took off quickly. Clients appreciated her motivation, encouragement, and genuine commitment. She wasn't just someone who designed workout routines. She inspired people, helped them push past their insecurities, and became a trusted friend in their transformation journeys. Colleagues admired her energy, optimism, and ability to connect with everyone she worked with. But beneath the surface, she was battling her own inner struggles. After relocating, Erlene often found herself questioning the meaning of life, searching for something deeper. That search led her towards spiritual practices. She became interested in alternative healing, meditation, and different philosophical perspectives. The more she explored, the more fascinated she became with ideas about inner balance, energy work, and unconventional views on the world. This newfound interest led her to a different social circle. Among the people she began spending time with was someone just as fascinated by self-discovery as she was. Their conversations revolved around spiritual growth, energy, and the search for deeper meaning in life. At first it was inspiring, but over time, everything started to change. Escharmond had a magnetic presence, charismatic, confident, and articulate. He had a way with words, adapting seamlessly to any conversation, making those around him feel understood. Surrounded by attention, he gave the impression of someone who had experienced a great deal and gained profound insights. He had his own views on energy, consciousness, and the nature of existence, and he eagerly shared them with those seeking answers. Erlene was intrigued by his philosophy. She felt that he understood her aspirations, that being around him would help her discover something greater. Their discussions quickly turned into a deeper connection. Together, they explored ways to cleanse the mind, break free from internal barriers, and reject the societal norms they believed were holding them back. At some point, he began introducing new ideas, suggesting that traditional methods of self-improvement were too limited. That true enlightenment required stepping beyond the familiar, abandoning fear, and expanding one's perception. He spoke about how real awareness could only be achieved by breaking free from mental constraints and pushing beyond conventional reality. That's when their trips began. They ventured outside the city, seeking remote locations where they could disconnect from the outside world. In these secluded places, Erling experimented with new techniques for self-discovery. Over time, these practices took a different turn. Restricted substances became part of the experience. She was told they were essential for reaching a higher state of awareness, for breaking away from the limitations of reality. Under their influence, she entered altered states of consciousness, experiencing sensations that felt like steps toward a deeper truth. Each session seemed like a journey toward greater understanding, but gradually, the lines began to blur. Perception became unstable. The distinction between reality and illusion grew harder to define. These experiences were intoxicating, yet they led further away from the world she once knew. At some point, this was no longer about seeking harmony. It had become something else entirely. Perhaps she didn't realize how deep she had gone. But step by step, her life was moving in a direction from which there was no return. Erling and Esh grew close quickly, and their relationship developed at a fast pace. However, over time, subtle warning signs began to emerge. At first, they seemed insignificant, small changes in his behavior that she didn't immediately pay attention to. Esh could be caring and affectionate, but at times he would suddenly become distant and withdrawn. His moods shifted unpredictably. Sometimes he spoke with deep inspiration, as if revealing the universe's greatest secrets to her. Other times, he grew irritable over small things, and would remain silent for long stretches. There were times when he would disappear entirely. He wouldn't respond to messages or calls, only to return as if nothing had happened. He explained that he needed time to clear his mind, to balance his internal energy. He claimed he could sense other people's emotions, and sometimes he had to isolate himself to free himself from their influence. Erling tried to be understanding, but these episodes left her feeling uneasy. Esh became more insistent that she needed to change her perception of the world, to let go of traditional beliefs. He told her that logic held people back from unlocking their true potential, that she had to trust her intuition, to listen to her inner voice. Over time, his conversations became increasingly unusual. He spoke about higher beings, about people who were connected to dark energy that prevented them from evolving. One thing in particular deeply unsettled Erling, his claim that there was something within her that needed purification. Esh insisted that he could sense an imbalance in her energy field, something that was blocking her from achieving full awareness. According to him, this was stopping her from reaching true harmony and unlocking her full potential. As time went on, his behavior became more unpredictable. Some days, he would tell her he could see her future or read her thoughts. Other times, he became agitated, arguing that she needed to trust only him. These mood swings became more intense. One day, he was an inspiring mentor. The next, he was withdrawn, short-tempered, and suspicious. One of the strangest topics he introduced was rituals. He claimed that ancient methods existed to remove internal barriers and achieve enlightenment. According to him, only through special ceremonies could a person be freed from the things preventing them from truly understanding life. At first, Erling thought of it as just another philosophical concept, but slowly, he began urging her to participate in these practices. He told her it was necessary, that she had to stop fearing the unknown. He insisted that only complete trust in him would allow her to reach true harmony. Erling didn't immediately realize that these conversations had crossed a dangerous line. To her, it seemed like nothing more than his personal interests, his unconventional views, nothing more. But over time, it became clear that his beliefs were not only shaping his own behavior, but also affecting their relationship. He demanded more and more that she trust him completely, listen only to him, and never question his methods. On the evening of July 15, 2020, Erling Cordiali and Esh Armand were in his apartment in Las Vegas. They had planned to evening together, dedicating it to a spiritual cleansing session. Discussions about reaching a higher state of consciousness had been ongoing for some time, and now, according to Esh, the moment had come to finally break free from all inner barriers. As part of the preparation, Esh insisted on using restricted substances. He believed that only under their influence could one achieve complete clarity and a connection with true reality. Erling was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. It wasn't the first time she had experimented with these substances, but this time, something felt different. The dosage was higher than usual. Within minutes, intense hallucinations began. The space around her warped, objects lost their familiar shapes, and sounds vibrated in unsettling waves. Her perception of reality was shifting rapidly. As the effects intensified, Esh became more agitated. His speech quickened, and he repeatedly claimed that he was seeing beyond the physical world, that his mind had opened, revealing deeper truths. Meanwhile, Erlene was struggling. Her visions were not bringing peace. Instead, they heightened her anxiety. She tried to focus, but her body felt unresponsive. Esh's behavior grew increasingly erratic. At one point, he approached Erlene and told her he sensed something unnatural within her. His voice turned sharp, his gaze heavy. He insisted that a dark energy surrounded her, and that she needed to be cleansed. When she tried to argue, the tension escalated. Esh accused her of resisting the process, claiming that she was blocking the release of negative energy. Frustration built in his voice. He kept repeating that he could feel something dark inside her, that she was carrying a force that needed to be purged. His words grew more unsettling with each passing moment. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. Erlene attempted to calm him, but he was no longer processing her words. His mind was clouded by the substances, and he became fixated on the idea that immediate action was necessary, that there was no more time to wait. Suddenly, he grabbed her wrists. She struggled to break free, but his strength, heightened by adrenaline and a frenzied state of mind, left her little chance. With a forceful motion, he pushed her, causing her to fall hard onto the floor, but it didn't stop there. Events unfolded at an alarming speed. One act of aggression wasn't enough for Esh. He grabbed a heavy glass candle holder from nearby and struck multiple times. Erlene's head slumped, her body convulsing slightly, but even that did not bring him to a halt. Then the nightmare escalated. A knife and other objects were used, leaving deep wounds. It only ended when the victim stopped breathing, when life had completely left her body. A chilling silence filled the apartment. Esh finally began to grasp what had happened. The rush of adrenaline slowly faded, and the effects of the substances wore off, leaving him in a state of shock. Blood covered the floor, his clothes, and his hands. The air was thick with the metallic scent of what had just occurred. For the next several hours, he struggled to process what he had done. He walked over to the body multiple times, as if hoping there was still a way to undo it. But there was nothing left to fix. On the morning of July 16, 2020, a call came into emergency services. The voice on the other end sounded unsteady, at times tense, but lacked the outright panic expected in such situations. Esh Arman told the dispatcher that his partner was no longer alive. He claimed it was an accident, that he had tried to help her, but it was too late. Officers arrived within minutes. Esh himself opened the door, and his appearance immediately caught their attention. His body was covered in dried blood, yet he looked more exhausted than terrified. There was no visible distress or shock, none of the reactions typically seen in those who have just witnessed a tragedy. As they stepped inside, officers were met with a chaotic scene. In the center of the room, Erlene Coeur Delai's body lay motionless. Her skin had turned pale, but dark bruises were evident on her face and neck. Her hands were scratched, surrounded by dried bloodstains. The state of the room indicated that a violent struggle had taken place. The bathroom, however, stood in stark contrast. It was suspiciously clean. Faint streaks of blood remained on the tiles, but most surfaces had clearly been scrubbed. In the washing machine, officers found clothes stained with blood. Esh's own outfit also appeared recently laundered, raising immediate suspicion. Near the bed, 2 candles stood unlit. Investigators noted traces of melted wax on Erlene's skin, a disturbing and unexplained detail. On the nightstand, they found 2 knives, a kitchen knife and a folding utility blade, both stained with dried blood. It was clear that an attempt had been made to cover up what had happened. Officers also examined a suitcase positioned near the entrance. Inside, they found personal belongings, cash, and documents. It looked as if Esh had been preparing to leave the scene, but for some reason, had either changed his mind or run out of time. When investigators began questioning him, his statements were inconsistent. He claimed to remember nothing, then insisted that Erlene had attacked him first, and that he had acted in self-defense. However, his body showed no scratches or injuries, no signs of a struggle that could support his version of events. Officers carefully observed Esh's behavior. He displayed no visible emotions. He didn't ask for help, nor did he show signs of shock over what had happened. Forensic experts continued their examination of the scene. In the refrigerator, they found bottles of alcohol. On the table, there were traces of a powdery substance, later confirmed to be restricted substances. The picture was becoming clearer. There were signs that someone had tried to cover up the evidence, but the attempt had been careless. Everything pointed to the fact that the crime had occurred while under the influence of mind-altering substances. As investigators documented the evidence, Esh was placed in the back of a patrol car. He didn't resist, didn't argue. He spoke only once. "I didn't want it to end this way." The investigation was only beginning, but at this stage, authorities had little doubt. His self-defense claim didn't hold up. After his arrest, detectives immediately shifted their focus to Esh Arman's background. The key question was no longer whether he was responsible, but rather, what had led him to this moment. The investigation quickly uncovered details from his past that might explain what had happened. Esh's real name was Akshay Anthony Dixit Kubiak. He was born in 1981 in India and later spent his childhood in Japan and the United States. His parents introduced him to spiritual practices, alternative medicine, and meditation at an early age. As a teenager, he studied Eastern philosophy, became interested in esoteric teachings, and pursued massage therapy and energy healing techniques. The turning point came in 2011. That year, he caught the attention of Garen James, the owner of an elite escort agency. Esh's striking appearance made him an ideal candidate for the high-end companionship industry. This led him to Las Vegas, where he quickly immersed himself in a world of wealthy clients, exclusive social circles, and easy money. In 2012, he was invited to appear on the reality show Gigolos, which brought him fame and financial success. However, with notoriety came new challenges: the pressure to stay in the spotlight, constant competition with colleagues, and the demands of the industry pushed Esh to seek ways to maintain the image of a successful and desirable man. He began using steroids to enhance his physical appearance and, at some point, moved on to stronger substances. Before long, his dependence on outside validation was compounded by a growing reliance on these substances. This led to increasing issues with aggression. In Las Vegas nightclubs, he was involved in multiple altercations, was arrested for driving under the influence, and his behavior became increasingly erratic. After Gigolos ended in 2016, Esh's popularity started to fade. His income declined, and his attempts to stay relevant in the entertainment industry failed. The money he had earned during his television days had been spent on a lavish lifestyle, cars, parties, expensive indulgences. By 2020, he was in a difficult position. Once a sought-after public figure, he was now living in a rented apartment, making money through occasional meetings with fans of the show who were willing to pay for his company. By the time he met Erling Cardula, his life had already spiraled out of control. Searching for purpose, he turned to spiritual practices, became fascinated with mysticism, and convinced himself that he had the ability to reshape reality. However, under the influence of mind-altering substances, these beliefs became an obsession. His relationship with Erling became a way for him to reclaim a sense of power. He didn't just see her as a partner, he saw her as someone he could influence. Over time, his confidence in his role in her life turned into a firm belief that he had control over not just her thoughts, but her destiny. On that fateful night, his mind, already fractured by years of substance abuse and self-delusion, finally snapped. Investigators pieced together his life step by step, and the more details emerged, the clearer it became. The crime was not random. Esh had been on this path for years. The trial began in 2021. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree intentional harm, arguing that Erling Cardula had been the victim of a brutal attack, and that the self-defense claim did not align with the evidence. The defense team built their case around claims of temporary mental instability. Esh insisted that he had lost control of his actions due to substance use and emotional distress. His attorneys attempted to argue that what happened that night was not a deliberate act. In his statements, he maintained that he had loved Erling and would never have intentionally harmed her. Public reaction was divided. Many, after learning the details of the case, condemned the brutality of the crime and called for the harshest possible sentence. Others, fans of Gigolos, stood by Esh, believing he was a victim of circumstance. Supporters posted messages on social media, and groups were formed to raise funds for his legal defense. Erling's family fought tirelessly for justice. Her parents and sisters spoke out in interviews, describing her as a kind and bright soul whose life was tragically cut short by someone who manipulated her trust. They emphasized that no justification could lessen the responsibility for what had been done. In December 2021, the court delivered its verdict. Esh Armand was found guilty of the crime against Erling Cor Jule and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Under the law, he would be eligible to apply for parole after serving 8 years. Erling's family expressed disappointment with the decision. Her loved ones believed the punishment was too lenient given the severity of the crime. However, the court took into account the defense's argument regarding his mental state at the time of the incident, which influenced the final ruling. According to the sentence, Esh will remain incarcerated until 2041, though he could have the opportunity for early release as soon as 2029. Whether he will be granted parole remains uncertain. Certain aspects of the case remain unanswered. What exactly happened in Esh's mind that night? Was it purely the influence of substances, or was there intent behind his actions? Why did he attempt to cover his tracks but ultimately call the police? And does he fully comprehend the weight of his guilt? The investigation is closed. The sentence has been handed down, yet the discussions continue. Even years later, this case remains controversial, dividing opinions between those who see him as a criminal and those who still believe he was a victim of his own demons.